Welcome to the California Public Utilities Commission. This is the Wildfire Safety Workshop, which is scheduled to start at 9:30 a.m. on this day, August 11, 2020. Our host will convene the meeting shortly. If you wish to speak during the public comment period, please press star 1, unmute your phone, and record your name and organization clearly when prompted. You will be placed in a queue in the order that you have identified yourself. When it comes time to speak, I will announce your name, and then I will open your line. You will have 4 minutes to speak. To withdraw your request, please press star 2. Please note that we are expected a high volume of callers. If we do not get to you right away to take your name, please be patient and stay on the line.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ryan Arba. I'm a Program and Project Supervisor for the Wildfire Safety Division. Thank you for joining us for our workshop today. Our goal today is to solicit your feedback on several key topics of interest to the Wildfire Safety Division this year. So again, my name's Ryan Arba, Wildfire Safety Division. I will be joined today by Arthur O'Donnell, who's a Senior Advisor for the Wildfire Safety Division. He'll be presenting on our Wildfire Mitigation Plan guidance and metrics. And later today, we will have an opportunity for comments. We've invited a few folks to present their comments initially. We will from there, we will be looking to the Webex chat box for your comments, where either myself or my colleague, Coco Tomasian, from the Wildfire Safety Division, will be reading those comments out loud, in particular if there are any questions for the group. Following our break this afternoon, we will have a presentation by John Mader, who's from our Wildfire Safety Advisory Board on the system hardening for electric utility resiliency. And then finally, we'll wrap up later this afternoon with next steps, including the process for receiving comments, key dates, and et cetera. So again, please remember to type any questions you have into the chat box, and that's where we will be going for comments later today. So our objectives for today. First off, we're going to share our 2021 Wildfire Mitigation Plan cycle timeline. Secondly, we'll be sharing our Wildfire Mitigation Plan guidelines and metric revisions and discuss that feedback. Third, we'll have, as mentioned before, a presentation by our Wildfire Safety Advisory Board member, John Mader, on the system hardening for electric utility resiliency threshold. And then finally, we'll wrap up today by sharing next steps for metrics. So just looking ahead to our timeline, through our workshop today, we'll be looking for your feedback through the chat box. And of course, we have others that have been invited to give verbal comments. However, we will be collecting all of your feedback by August 26th. And this announcement went out in the notice that we issued to the service list. But again, we will have, following the end of the workshop, we'll have a 2-week period to solicit your comments on the staff proposals that were submitted as part of this workshop. By October 31st of this year, the WSD will be submitting our Wildfire Mitigation Plan recommendations to the Commission, and then our statutory deadline for this to be completed is by December 1st of this year. And with that, I will turn it over again to our colleague, Arthur O'Donnell, Senior Advisor for the Wildfire Safety Division, to discuss our staff proposal for the Wildfire Mitigation Plan guidance and metrics update.
Thank you, Ryan, and I hope that everyone can hear me. Nod your head if you can hear me. I can see you on the video. Thank you all for joining us. This is a little bit of a leap of faith for the Wildfire Safety Division, in that this is the first workshop that we've done totally remotely. And I wish I had an audience in front of me. It always helps to kind of keep the energy level high. But what we'll be doing today is going through a deck of slides that give you an overview for how we're thinking about revising the Wildfire Mitigation Plan guidance for 2021 evaluation. And then after we go through the slides, I'll pull up the staff proposal that we sent out in advance of the workshop and go over a few of the items that in particular we want to call attention to. As Ryan mentioned, the point here is, one, to give you a heads up of where our thinking is in advance of issuing a draft resolution for consideration by the Commission. Before the end of the year, we have a statutory deadline of December 1st, which means that sometime in October we'll be issuing a draft resolution through the normal process at the Public Utilities Commission for comments. But we want to give you early indications of some of the things that we're looking at, and that's what I'll be talking about today. Okay. Our goals are really to make three major changes, which is to increase the standardization of the documents, to improve the structure of the WMP, and to update some of the metrics and data. In particular, we really want to streamline the amount of information that we're requiring from the utilities as part of the WMP. Last year, we asked for an awful lot of information, and some of it kind of like got bogged down in the way of reporting. And so as we go through this, you'll see that we're going to be eliminating some categories or versions of information. We're going to be moving information around within the documents, and we're going to be kind of taking away from what was called the supplemental data request, which was information that we felt necessary that didn't fit into the WMP last year. And as I go through this, I hope that you see the logic that we're approaching to this. Okay. The recommendations that go into the resolution come from a number of sources and stakeholders, including the lessons that we learned and that the utilities and the people who commented on the WMPs learned from the 2020 review. From the Wildfire Safety Advisory Board, they issued a report at the end of June with a number of recommendations. You'll see several of those recommendations woven into our proposal today. We have a secondary requirement to actually report to the Commission about how we're dealing with all of the recommendations in the WSAB report, and that'll happen later in the year as well. Right? Utilities and outside stakeholders, public comments. Back in January, there's public comments on the form of the WMP. Then we got comments on the WMP results themselves. Then we got comments on the resolutions. All of that goes into our thinking. And as Ryan pointed out, we will be taking written comments on these workshops and on our proposals. And there'll be a date, August 26th, by which we ask you to submit those comments. And finally, outside agencies. As you probably know, we worked very closely with CAL FIRE, and they were instrumental in helping us to understand how to interpret much of the data that we had gotten from the utilities. And so we look to them for guidance as well as to what's really important, what we should be focusing on, and what's going to be important for tracking going forth in the future. Okay. There are 9 recommendations that have been prioritized, and this is the list of them. The next set of slides kind of provides a little bit more detail on each, so I won't spend time on this slide, but move on to the first one, which is to standardize the data across utilities. We got a lot of variation, and part of it you can attribute to the amount, the sheer plethora of data that we asked for from utilities, and the fact that people did not have very much time. The guidance decision came out in mid-December, and the WMPs were due for filing in the first week of February, which left a lot of people scrambling. And what that led to was highly inconsistent responses to some of the elements within the WMP, and we really wanted to avoid that this year. Other goals are to have streamlined reporting, as I mentioned, and also to improve our cross-utility comparisons so that we have a better sense of how each of the utilities are responding to the risks and proposing mitigations and seeing how effective those mitigations are. Recommendation number 2 is very similar in terms of consistency and transparency of submissions. We really want to have consistent formatting, and that was an issue for a couple of the utilities. So we're going to be trying to be very clear about the order in which we're seeking information and have that to follow a better logistical thread. This year, there will be a new table, which is a WMP completeness checklist. Those of you who are familiar with the underlying statutes from AB 1054 and subsequent revisions know that there are about 22 requirements for the WMP. We, as a first order of business, had the folks who were evaluating the WMPs look to make sure that that information was in the document, and that led to a little bit of an Easter egg hunt because there was no common thread as to how to track that information. So this year, as you'll see later on, there's going to be a table that asks the utilities to show us where that particular requirement is addressed in the WMP document. We believe that not only will this save us a lot of time at the very beginnings of our evaluation, but it will also cut down on the number of data requests that we had to go back to almost immediately with the utilities and ask for, well, you were supposed to do this, where is that? Or kind of like, can you provide us this information because we're not finding it, right? There's also an effort to tie the quarterly data submissions that came out of last year's evaluation, the compliance reports, to the annual WMP updates. And we can talk about that a little bit more as our conversation goes on today. Recommendation 3 is to improve our focus on local outcomes and outreach metrics. In particular, we'll be referring to 2 very recent commission decisions. One is in the second phase of the public safety power shutoff rulemaking, and there are some specific recommendations and requirements that the utilities need to address, and those will be incorporated into the WMP this year. And also community outreach metrics that were in the overall WMP rulemaking, right? And the decision out of March was D20-03004. So if you're not familiar with those, I would urge you to go on the Commission's website and look into the documents for final decisions and familiarize yourselves with those decisions, right? And we'll also have a little bit more consistency on data related to each of the mitigations that the utilities are proposing and following. Number 4, ratepayer impact metrics. In the supplemental data request, we had asked the utilities to give us projections of what they thought the ratepayer impact for the proposed mitigations might be. Now, we have the caveat here that WSD is not involved in determining the reasonableness of expenditures nor approving the final plans. That is all work for the Commission's general rate cases, but we want to begin to get a better handle on how much this might cost and what ratepayers might see out of it. And as we go forward, as we improve the risk profile, how we can avoid the costs that are associated with wildfires, right? Because that was never taken into account in general rate cases. It was also not taken into account in the PSPS calculations. So we're really looking to try and get a handle on the distinction between what utilities are currently spending on their mitigation programs and what the added costs and ratepayer impacts will be from the mitigations that they propose, so that the folks who are litigating the general rate cases have better information and a better basis for making the determinations that are necessary in those proceedings. Recommendation number 5 is to try and have a better description and expectation for goals versus objectives versus targets. We found that several of the utilities conflated these things and gave us the same information when we really see them as really distinct, right? The goals should be aligned with the WSD goal, which is to reduce the drivers of wildfire, in particular ignitions, equipment failures. The objections are utility-specific milestones in order to meet those goals. And those were generally couched in a, what are you going to do before the next fire season? What are you going to do over the next year? What are you going to do over the next 3 years? And then the 5-year goal. So we're hoping to provide more guidance so that there's a better understanding of that and more consistency. And also program targets. Targets are defined in the WMP guidance. And if I were to change the definition at all, I'd say that these are what the utilities are projecting to do in the next year as part of their program, right, in the next year and in the next year. And these are expressed actually in quantitative numbers, numbers of poles replaced, numbers of inspections, the mileage of covered conductor compared to the existing bare wire conductor. Those are kinds of things that the utility will be making projections about, and then each year we can come back and see where they are, right? There's not penalties for not meeting those targets, but it is a signal to the Wildfire Safety Division that maybe some people were more optimistic or pessimistic in terms of what they're able to accomplish, or maybe outside factors have gotten in the way. We've certainly had weather impacts. We've certainly had impacts from the COVID-19 concerns in terms of utility crews being able to go out into the field and do the work. Those are things that are really important for us to know so that we can make mid-course corrections as we move along in the implementation of the wildfire mitigation plans. I'm going to breathe here and then move on to number 6, which is a new recommendation for citing state and federal rules and proceedings. And this came out of the Wildfire Safety Advisory Board report or recommendation, so that we're firmly grounded in the policies and laws. And we'll be asking for the utilities to cite what they're referring to, right, when they propose certain mitigations or have discussions within the WMP. And this is certainly something that's open to a lot of discussion, and I hope that we'll get into that discussion today, or you can comment on it in the written responses to the workshop. Number 7, investor-owned utility staff training practices and worker qualifications. This is another WSAB recommendation in which we want to make sure that the folks that are out in the field are properly trained to identify any gaps in wildfire mitigation expertise and what the plans are to fill those gaps. This is actually, the utilities have always had training programs, and in particular for this kind of work out in the field, the Commission just needs to have a better understanding of what minimum qualifications are being applied, how people are kept up to date with the many changes. This is actually a fairly rapidly changing environment as we learn from each other and as we learn from other states and other places like Australia. And we want to make sure that California really sets the pace on state-of-the-art in terms of expectations for training and to help the utilities identify where those gaps might be. Number 8, and this is contact information for those executing the WMP. This is a requirement from the statutes, and what we found was in the first initial filings, the utilities did not identify the individuals, right, who are responsible for each of the program areas, so we had to go back and ask for those names. It is also important for our compliance branch to be able to access those people. Programs, but recognize that personally identifiable information should remain confidential. So we're giving the utilities the option to provide that information in a redacted form to WSD when you file your WMP so that we have it and it may not be public, right? There will also be an expectation that credentials of experts who are referenced in the plan be appended to the Wildfire Mitigation Plan, and any research that helps to identify changes in the way that you're looking at the plans going forward, right? We'll also ask for that. Again, these are recommendations that came out of the WSAB, and so we want to have some conversation about that. And then finally, the whole issue of public safety power shutoffs is very important to us. And last year, we asked for information about PSPS in a number of places, right, in various sections of the WMP and in the supplemental data request. This year, we're moving all of that information into a new section at the tail end of the WMP so that it's all in one place. And this will comprise several tables that are information that has already been provided by the utilities, right, with updates, and some new categories of information. And that's another area that we'd like your comments on to just make sure that we're getting the best information, the most effective use of that information going forward, right? And then there are, as I mentioned, some recent commission decisions that impact what we expect from the utilities, and we'll detail them as well. Okay, these are upcoming dates. August 26th is the deadline to share your comments for consideration of what we're talking about today and the staff report. We are asking to adhere to a talk them through in order that you focus your recommendations or comments, and these will be sent via email to the address that you see, Wildfire Safety Division at cpuc.ca.gov, and also to serve the service list of R1810007, which is the service list that we've been using for this process throughout. October 31st is the official date by which we should be submitting our WMP guidelines and processes for the safety certification, right? And that is so that we can have a commission decision by December 1st. Now, I will warn you that these dates are the outside dates, and in order to meet these dates, given the commission's meeting calendar, we will probably be looking at a PUC meeting of November 19th, which means that we'll have to get the draft resolution out in the mail by mid-October. So these dates are kind of like statutory dates, and we want to make sure that we meet them by moving ahead. Okay, I'm going to, before we get into comments from the respondents that I've asked for, I'm going to close this document out and open up the staff draft document that there. Can I get a nod of a head, or Ryan, can you tell me that this is visible on the screen?
We can see it.
AR30, we can see it.
Great. Okay. I'm not going to go through every single page of this document. This was provided to you in advance, and it's also on our website, the Wildfire Plans website at the CPUC. This is information that I just went over, which is the objectives for revision. And what this document is fairly much a nuts and bolts. This is how we plan to change the tables within the WMP. These are the, you'll see that there's an issue statement, which is generally that either we got inconsistent information from the people who are filing the utilities, or that somehow we were not fully describing what we really were looking for. And so the issue statement kind of says what the problem is, and then there'll be recommended changes, right? So this is just an example, and I've already gone over this, which is that we're asking for contact information from the program owners and the executive level with overall responsibility for the WMP, that there should be appended to the report credentials for those that kind of like have particularly important interfaces in making sure that the WMP is implemented. And again, that the contact information may be filed confidentially under a redacted form. Okay. This is the area which is adherence to statutory requirements. As I mentioned, there are 22 requirements now listed in Public Utilities Code Section 8386C. And so what will be in the template will be essentially a checklist. I didn't include all of them here, but this is just so that you get an idea of it. So requirement number 2, what that requirement is, and we'll ask the utilities to be filling in with specificity where we can find that information in the WMP or in ancillary materials. Hopefully this is all going to be in the public documentation because these are the things that we have to checklist. And then this will be a first order of business for staff, is to go through and make sure that it's there so that we know where to look for it. There is often a disjoint between the logic of the legislature and the logic of the commission in terms of how we structure things. And this will help us all be on the same page as we're going forward. Okay. This is new in 2 terms. One is that this is information that we put into the resolutions for the conditional approval of the WMPs from last year. We had a table which was a summary of expenditures. And so instead of kind of like trying to aggregate that at the tail end of our evaluation, we're asking the utilities to put that up front, right? And this is basically what you were expecting to spend on your sum total of mitigations that are listed in the plan. We will be asking for actual expenditures for 2020. The utilities ought to have that information. We're pretty close to that information at the time. And just asking, you know, for a calculation of the difference between what was expected, then the going forward projected spend for the other 2 years in the plan. It's important to point out that these WMPs that will be filed in 2021 are really updates to last year's plan. We're not asking for entirely new plans that will come in 2023, but almost all of the information that we're seeking this year is updates to what was filed last year and any explanations for changes going forward, as well as this very important what actually happened during 2020. So that's going to be a really significant part of our evaluation. And something new that will also be in this chapter will be a summary of expenditures by the 10 categories of mitigations, right? We did not ask for this last year, and we really felt that it would be very helpful for everyone to see the bundles of spending, right? Because there will be in each of the tables for each mitigation information and data about what that program costs. But we want to see it in terms of the portfolio of initiatives and mitigations that go along with these 10 areas: risk mapping, et cetera, grid design, hardening, vegetation management. Now, we know that grid design, system hardening, vegetation management are 2 of the top expenditure areas, and some other areas like resource allocation and even data governance did not have much spending associated with it. Still, we're going to be asking for that information. Okay, one other new part of this section of the WMP, we'll be moving the information about projected electric cost increases or ratepayer impacts from both wildfires and from the mitigations. This is information that we asked for in the supplemental data request last year. We decided that it would be good to have it in this document going forward. Okay, and there'll be a table for that. Okay, I'm going to pause there and just ask Ryan if any questions have come over in the chat for clarification of what we've been talking about so far.
Hey, Arthur. I've not seen anything sent in the chat to everyone. However, Coco may have seen some, so just want to check if either Coco or others from Wildfire Safety Division have any on that.
Hey, Arthur, we did get a few questions come in on the Q&A. One was, will the utilities be submitting budgets with their WMPs? And another one about spending for PSPS.
Right, okay, so this is the closest that we have in terms of budgets. Again, this forum is not where the Commission approves the spending. So you have to expect that what the utilities are putting in for their expected costs of mitigations will feed into the actual budget allocation requests that they make in their general rate cases when those GRCs come up for approval. It's an early check so that in that proceeding, people can refer back to the WMPs and say, well, you know, back there in 2021, you said that this is what it was going to cost, and now you're asking for this. Why, right? Again, we don't make that determination. That is not in our statutory mandate. In fact, we've been told not to try and determine the reasonableness or in any way pre-decide what the utilities may spend on this. And the usual mechanism in the Commission is for the utilities to set up memorandum accounts or other kinds of accounts where they track costs until it comes time for review in the general rate case. And that's what we would expect the process to be going forward. But yes, you will see numbers. Those numbers really should be as close to what the utilities expect to spend and what they will be coming and ask for in the future. But we know that if there's a 2 or 3 year time lag, that some things change, costs change. We've already gotten indications that, for instance, projections of the cost of doing a mile of undergrounding in a certain part of the utility territory got a lot more expensive last year, right? Because of weather conditions, because of personnel availability, because of other things. So you have to expect that that's going to be. So at least you'll have some numbers to work with.
And Arthur, while you were speaking, we got a couple of additional questions. One specifically related to how expenditures will be verified. And that's one of the questions. And then there's a second question related to the SDR, if you want to take that first, and then I can ask the second question.
Okay. Again, verification comes through the Commission's audit of memorandum accounts and in the general rate case filing. One of the recent changes in Commission process for general rate cases is that after that decision is rendered, the utilities on an annual basis need to come back with 2 accountability reports. One is a risk spend allocation report in which they tell us what they've actually spent, right, on the risk mitigation proposals that they made. And this is more than just wildfire safety, right? This is for all of the risks that are identified through the risk assessment mitigation phase of the general rate case and then litigated in the GRC, right? So one report is, what did you actually spend? And if it's different from what the Commission approved, you have to tell the Commission why. Okay, that's one report. And the second accountability report is essentially an effectiveness report. Right. This is, you said that spending this amount of money on this mitigation will reduce the amount of risk or the numerical score for risk by such amount. We want to see that verified. So those are 2 new accounting mechanisms that the Commission has put into place that have not really been put into practice yet. I believe that what we'll be seeing will be the first accountability reports out of the Southern California Edison general rate case that was litigated 2 years ago with a decision last year. So we'll be seeing those. Those reports are actually evaluated. The spending report is evaluated by the Commission's Energy Division, and the effectiveness report is evaluaed by the risk assessment and safety analytics section within the new within the new Safety Policy Division. And we, of course, have good working relationships with them. So that's where that information will go. And then, Coco, you had a question about the supplemental?
Sorry, that came in was kind of switching gears, specific to the comments about streamlining the data and process and pulling in some of the former supplemental data request data into the template, WMP template. The question is there going to be a supplemental data response required in 2021?
Well, we'll get into the details of the streamlining, right, as we move down in the sections of what is coming up. And maybe, Coco, I'll ask you to respond to that. There will always be data requests, right? Whether it's an omnibus supplemental data request like last year, I think that our intent is to minimize that and try and get all of the information identified well in advance and get the utilities to provide us information. Tomorrow there'll be a big discussion about the data schema that WSD is developing, which is a lot of the information that relates to the geospatial data, the maps that we're putting together, the locational information for a lot of these mitigation activities. That's all going to be asked for in advance, right? Even not part of the WMP. It's important information, but it's really not necessary for the evaluation of the WMP. The supplemental data request last year was kind of an overflow bucket in which we realized that we were asking for an awful lot from the utilities in the WMP. We weren't sure what exactly was precisely necessary for evaluation, but we knew that we needed additional information like those cost projections and like PSPS information. So if there is a supplemental data request in that form, I'm hoping that it will be a lot less extensive than last year. Coco, do you want to add something to that?
The only context I'll add, and thanks for that, Arthur, is tomorrow we'll cover some elements of our draft data standards, and the intent is in the long term to have the regular data reporting updates supplement and replace this data, the standard or supplemental data request. So I hope that answers the question. We'll get some more context and color to that when we talk about the data schemas and the data standards tomorrow.
Okay, great. I'm going to move forward here, and we'll have opportunities for further questions, and certainly after the respondents talk about the issues, and so many of the things that are coming to your mind out there in the audience may well be addressed by those. The next couple of sections are really information that already existed in the WMP, but is broken out a little bit better. In particular, there was a section 4 of the WMP, that became kind of a catch-all. And there was a lot of different information in there. There was the lessons learned information. There was part of the narrative portion from the Section 2 metrics. There was the input and directional vision for the WMP. All we're doing here is separating that out so that it has its own section and maybe stands out a little bit better. So I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail about that. You can see, again, there will be recommended changes on particular elements of that. So please refer to that. And as I said, like, we had some confusion over the difference between goals, objectives, and program targets, and we hope that this will help put everybody on the same page on that. Worker qualifications, we talked a little bit about that. And this came out of the WSAB report, and there are some expectations for particularly workers in the field doing vegetation inspections and vegetation management programs of training, and we want to make sure that the utilities are all following best practices and have qualified electrical workers, right, for specific work. And we are happy to take comments on this as to what you think that might entail, as this is all fairly new in terms of our expectations of the utilities reporting to us. We continue to look for two different kinds of metrics. One are progress metrics, and these are built off of the targets that the utilities establish for each year. How many poles, how many miles of wires, how many inspections. Those are numerical, and they are often lagging indicators, right? So there is a continued request for that information, but also an emphasis on outcome metrics, because really what we're looking to do is to reduce the drivers of wildfires and the incidents of wildfires associated with utility activities and equipment. So those are important distinctions. It's not really that much different from last year, but within the major area, I think it was Section 5 in last year's WMP, we asked for something like, about 15 different tables of information. And some of those tables had a lot of different line items. And what we're trying to do is to streamline that so that the utilities don't have to do calculations, for instance, on normalization, right? Because we asked for raw data about how many findings per circuit or per territory. And what we want to do is to be able to have the information that we get separately from the WMP to provide us with the information to do that normalization ourselves and cut down on what we considered were either misunderstandings or just bad calculations that we had to go back and rectify. So when you'll see going forward in the table, that was table 2, will be a lot fewer line items of requests for information. There were a number of changes to that table, and they fall into these categories, right? This is data that's duplicative, right? We asked for the same information in Table 5 as in Table 18. This geospatial data that we had talked about is required at a higher granularity. That really doesn't work well in the WMP, right? So we're asking for that separately. We're going to be refining the data schema to allow the normalization, and you'll be hearing more about that tomorrow. Some of the tables ask for a 5-year history of certain data. We'll be asking for your opinions on whether we need to have that 5-year history in the WMP each year updated, or whether it's better for us to have a database with the past history and just ask the utilities to update that. That would probably save us a lot of time. There is data requirements that are submitted on a quarterly basis and in the annual updates that provide narrative. And some of that doesn't really lend itself to the graphs and the tables, right, but should be put in narrative form. And there are a number of areas in which we asked for data related to information that the Commission already has in hand through incident reports, right? For instance, accidental deaths. So the question there is, do we need to reduce that into table form, or should we rely on the incident reports to the PUC to keep a running tally on that? And then, as I mentioned, some information like there was a Table 7 on methodology for determining your mitigations that really just does not lend itself to a table. I mean, that's really a narrative. So I'm not going to go into every nuts and bolts of the next set of changes that we're recommending. I do recommend that you read through the documents, and if you have particular suggestions on how to make this clearer, right? But one of the areas that we do want to point out is this issue of reporting near misses. Okay? We really felt that there was inconsistency in understanding of what near misses entailed, and there was in the guidance a definition, but what we want to do is we recommend a changing of that definition to something that was used in another commission proceeding. And here's the two differences, right? Here are all sorts of events which the utility may not be aware of, right? You know, kind of like they're going to know about wires down, but they may not always have documentation of things like line flaps or heat generation loss because they're coming in later afterwards. The new recommended definition that you can see on the screen is really physical evidence of things that did not lead to ignitions, but very easily could have. And they are manifest in charring, melting, heavy smoke deposits, visible evidence of arcing that could indicate heat was present, that kind of thing. So we're going to ask for your comments on this change in definition. We think that it will help us understand what's really going on out in the field better. And so that's a change that we have recommended here. For the next one, again, we felt that the way that information was reported didn't really kind of give us what we needed to know. And so it was kind of like number of inspection findings in these different areas or levels of inspection findings. And what we want to do is narrow it down to circuit miles inspected so that we're really focused and have a consistent kind of numerator and denominator for comparing across the utilities. Okay, now that's a technical thing, and I'm going to ask Coco to make sure that I got it right.
I think it's fine, Arthur, and you know, to this end, as we talk about the data standards tomorrow, I'll cover some of this a little more in depth. So I think this is totally fine for a kind of preface.
Great. A lot of this other information is already in there. Again, we'll be taking out the 4 lines that say inside the high fire threat district, outside the fire threat district, in Tier 1, or Tier 2, Tier 3. WSD in the future ought to be able to make that analysis with the information that we've gotten. So all this is here is a streamlined version of what was Table 2 in last year's WMP. It may not have the same number, right, because there's going to be different tables ahead of us. But you can see that instead of 10 line items for utility inspection findings, it's down to 4. And this gives us the information that we need without all the variations on it. And hopefully this will be a lot more simple. I do want to just call out this last area in which we had wildfire ignitions and critical infrastructure impacted. There will be a little bit of overlap, and in some cases we're moving that requested information into another part of the WMP or into the PSPS section, for instance. When we provide the resolution, there will be a new template, right? And all of this will be spelled out. And hopefully it will be spelled out so that it's really transparent, that you understand what it is that we're looking for where in the document. So that's really kind of our goal. Just jumping ahead here, last year we asked for additional metrics, whatever each of the utilities might be using. We found that there was very highly inconsistent reporting on that, with some utilities reporting a lot of different things, some not reporting anything at all, some giving us variations like 7 different colors of outage information. For the time being, we're not recommending changes to that. What we want to do going forward is to see if there's a way to standardize really valuable additional metrics that we haven't been asking for, but that will probably go into the update for the 2023 WMP. In the meantime, everything else will be the same. Right? We talked about program targets, accidental deaths. We presume that deaths are accidental, so we're going to change the nomenclature. These issues of OSHA reportable injuries, the Commission should be getting incident reports and those kinds of things. So the question is this really necessary for WMP? There is a strong indication that, yeah, we do want to track this over time, but the best way of reporting that. There are a couple of things that may not be necessary in the future. Mapping data, some weather information, right? So our recommendation is to eliminate it from the WMP, but we're not eliminating it from the body of information that the utilities provide to the Commission and to WSD. And that there'll be more discussion of that in tomorrow's talk. This key drivers of ignition metrics, right? These turned out to be a really important table that we relied on a lot in our evaluation of the WMPs. But we are making one change, which is to change the description of this from rate of ignition, or to rate of ignition from probability of ignition, so that we get a little bit more precise, right? So that we're dealing with real numbers, not potential numbers, right? And so hopefully there'll be a little bit more guidance on that. Recent use of PSPS, that's going to get changed, moved into the other section. Right, I'm going to stop there because that was a lot of the underlying data, and ask if there's any questions about what I just talked about. And just to give a time check is that I have about 5 minutes before we move into the next section of. Okay, hearing none, I'll just point out that we did not do much change to the actual reporting of mitigations. In some cases, that 5-year data may not be necessary. There were, in the effort to be consistent in creating the tables last year, inclusion of several columns of information that just were not appropriate. And here's a couple of examples, is that most of the tables included a column entitled line miles to be treated, but really was not relevant, right? Especially when you're looking at things like resource allocation. Right, so we're going to do a better job of constructing the tables so that they're not all cookie cutter, and that only the relevant information is asked for, because honestly it became a little confusing for our evaluators when they saw blanks in a lot of the cells of the tables, and that led to data requests and responses from the utilities say, well, we don't report that. I mean, we don't collect that data and we don't report it, so we didn't put it in there. We want to avoid that. This is important, and as I mentioned, we're trying to consolidate information about the PSPS events and the directional vision, so it will all go into a separate chapter and all be in one place. This is information that we've already asked for, right? There are a couple of tables, Table 12, portions of Table 2.3 and 2.10 that were specific to summary data for the PSPS events. In the supplemental data request, we had also asked for things like percent of customers impacted, ignitions avoided by PSPS, some more information about frequency, scope, duration. We're going to move all of that into one place so it's not scattered throughout. This next section are some possibilities for additional metrics that should be considered, especially regarding community outreach. And this comes from two places. This comes from the WSAB, and it also comes from that decision that I referenced in the PSPS and the Wildfire Mitigation Plan decisions, so that we get a better handle on this. And so please review these. I'm not going to go into them in detail right now, but this is what we're thinking of, and what we'd like to do is to get a sense from the utilities and from the stakeholders as to accessibility of this information, value of this information going forward, what's really important to follow. And as I mentioned, there was a major change in the May decision in the PSPS rulemaking, which is that beginning with this next report, each utility plan needs to include short, medium, and long-term actions that the utility will take to reduce the impact of and need for de-energization events, right? This is really important. The Commission has stated again and again that we perceive PSPS as a last resort and recognize that it is also one of the most effective means to prevent ignitions. So that's the balance that we're trying to deal with and to minimize the use of PSPS going forward. And so we're asking the utilities, what's your plan? How are you going to do that? What other things are you doing in the WMP that can help reduce the need for PSPS? Okay, and this is the new section, which is citing relevant statutes and orders, right? So the question is here, where does this go, right? We're thinking of putting it into an appendix, or it can be associated with each section of the mitigations, depending on where it is. But what we'd like to do is to see a brief description or summary of the relevant portion of the statute or the regulation that is associated with that. And here it recommends being in the appendix. Okay. That's all in this document. So that's your guided tour through it. This is, again, I said, available on the PUC's website. So we have 2 minutes before we go into hearing some specific responses from folks but that gives us an opportunity if there's any final questions about this document before moving on to that. Okay, hearing none. I'm going to close out that document. I'm going to stop sharing. And we're going to ask for respondents for particular insights as to responses to what we're proposing and how they think the whole evaluation process might be better. And we have on top, I'm going to do them in this order, Tyson Switek, who's Wildfire Mitigation Program Manager for San Diego Gas and Electric, will come on first. Then Katie Marsoni, who has been very involved in all of this on behalf of the Utility Reform Network, Turn. Joseph Mitchell with Mussey Grade Road Alliance, who's always one of my go-to people for understanding technicalities. And finally, Henry Burton, who is with the California Public Advocates Office. Many of you know that this used to be the Office of Ratepayer Advocates, Division of Ratepayer Advocates, with new nomenclature, but still the same mission to look out for the interests of ratepayers in all PUC proceedings. So we're going to ask each of them to give us 5 to 7 minutes of a response, maybe raise issues that they think are important for us to take into consideration. So if Robert is still with us, can you unmute Ty so that he can provide his insights to this?
Hello, Arthur. It's Robert. I will do that right now.
Okay.
Hello, Arthur. Can you hear me?
We can.
All right. Thank you. So again, my name is Tyson Switek. I'm the Wildfire Mitigation Program Manager with SCP. To start, our high-level take on the Wildfire Safety Division staff proposal on the WMP requirements, in general, is that it's a step in the right direction. We appreciate staff has incorporated feedback throughout the WMP process and has really streamlined some of the requirements, where it makes sense to do so. Specifically,
okay, Tyson, can I ask you to just, wherever you're speaking into, can you get a little closer? You sound distant and we get a little bit of echo on you.
Oh, sure. Is this a little better?
That sounds better, except we see the top of your head.
Oh, okay. I'll just hold the phone right up to my, is this working better? Okay,
yes,
thank
you.
Okay, so again, we appreciate that staff has incorporated feedback, and really streamlined certain requirements. Specifically, we want to talk about the removal of the standard data request due to the redundancy with quarterly reports, the consolidation of tables with redundant information, and the removal of the normalization requirements, because that did cause, some confusion. Those are things that we all agreed upon and appreciate, and it really does demonstrate that the staff has listened to some of the feedback, whether from utilities or interveners, and has made some improvements based on their own lessons learned and as part of this public process. As far as other suggestions and comments, we did meet with the other 3 large IOUs, and while we all have kind of individual comments that we'll be providing in writing on some of the specific details, there were at least a couple big picture themes that we all had alignment on and I wanted to bring up and discuss today. And then a couple of, very specific issues that we thought were important enough to bring up and discuss in this forum. So the first of the big picture items is really around schedule. So it looks like the final requirements for the WMP guidance is going to be finalized December 1st. Just want to highlight that's not too far away from the December 19th guidance that was issued last year. And Arthur, to the point you made earlier, it was pretty difficult with the turnaround time and the amount that was required to produce complete wildfire mitigation plans that met all of the requirements. And we as utilities, we want to provide excellent wildfire mitigation plans that meet the expectations and requirements of staff. And if we were to be given, even just a little bit more time, if we could have this by, maybe the middle of November as opposed to the beginning of December, that would certainly help us in being successful to meet staff expectations on the quality and completeness of the WMPs. The second kind of big picture item, again, is around any more streamlining opportunities that we have for the Wildfire Mitigation Plan. This proposal already takes into account some streamlining, but again, the goal of the Wildfire Mitigation Plan is to reduce catastrophic wildfires in the state of California while minimizing, the impacts to our customers while doing so. And to the extent, that the data we're collecting, and to your point earlier, Arthur, it still is a lot of data that we're collecting in these WMP submittals and on the quarterly reports. To the extent that maybe not all of that data is incredibly useful or relevant to the analysis, if we can just continue to be open to learning and saying like, oh, okay, yeah, we use this, but we don't use this type of data, to incorporate that feedback into future requirements and to continue to streamline, or to the extent that there is overlap with other proceedings, such as the SMAP, RAMP, GRCs, PSPS OIRs. We understand the need for some redundancy as they're covering similar topics, but to the extent that, one proceeding can cover certain requirements and another covers, different requirements. Again, just in general, looking to streamline some of the requirements in the WMP. On some of the more specific issues, I think it was page 12. There's a requirement on reporting evacuation notices to customers from utilities. And so again, we as utilities, we want to be really good partners with our first responder agencies and help in the development of evacuation planning and to understand ingress and egress routes and where the real dangerous issues are so that we can incorporate those things into our risk model. And that helps with our hardening decision making. However, we do not think it's, and we believe our first responders agree that it's the utilities, area or role to own evacuation and the evacuation notices to customers. So we'll be curious to see, CAL FIRE's comments and responses on this. But again, we don't think utilities should be the ones in charge of leading an evacuation and just noticing customers during an actual emergency. And then finally, the last specific comment we had that we wanted to talk about, you covered this earlier, Arthur, on definition of a near miss. We actually think all of the utilities that we really should stay broad there. Essentially, any fault on the electric system could lead to an ignition. And even beyond that, during post-shutoff, after a PSPS, the post-event patrol, any damages found that would have been energized or, could have been energized had we not done a full patrol and discovered the damage, or opportunities for faults there too. And I just don't want this narrower definition of near miss to eliminate that data. It's really good data. It's the data that essentially populated Table 11. It's the data that a lot of our mitigations are targeting. We want to reduce faults to reduce ignition. So we think it's really important that definition remains broad to include all near misses. That's all I have to discuss today. I appreciate the opportunity to provide my comments and be part of the process. And I'm looking forward to hear what the other speakers have to say today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tyson, and I appreciate the level of information that you're giving us and your observations. I will just respond to two of the items. One is we want to give the utilities and the other parties as much heads up as possible, right? And while December 1st that doesn't seem like it's all that much different from last year, you will be seeing the resolution with the proposed template probably in mid-October, right, so that you have more warning, right? And while there may be changes around the edges, right, based on parties' comments and what the commissioners take into consideration, that'll give you, kind of like 90% of what to expect, okay? Also, as I said, while there are some new areas of reporting, a lot of this is just continuation of the reporting in the past, and the bulk of the WMP is in the mitigation sections, and we're not proposing really any changes to that. Okay, finally, thank you for talking about near misses. This is something that we really want to have the best working definition that leads to the best information, so we'll take that into consideration. So thank you, and we may give you an opportunity to respond to the other respondents. Right now, I'd like to turn it over to Katie Marsoni from TURN. And Robert, can you make sure that Katie is able to talk to us?
Hello, Katie, your line is open.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me okay? I've been having some phone connection issues. I'd like to start out, much the same way and say that TURN really appreciates the work that the Wildfire Safety Division is doing to standardize these submissions. We also are concerned about time frame and our ability to review, given that there's a short time frame for review of the Wildfire Mitigation Plan. So to the extent that information excuse me, is provided clearly and fully the first time, it really helps us do the review that we'd like to do without loading the utilities down with data requests. In particular, I'd like to point out the completeness checklist as a great addition to the Wildfire Mitigation Plan submission. I think that's a really helpful tool to help people go through the different submissions. TURN is concerned about wildfires, but we're also concerned about the impact of the wildfire mitigations on ratepayers in terms of the bill impact. So for that reason, we're very supportive of including things like the expenditures and the changes in the revenue requirement, but that has to be balanced with, I guess what I'll say is we're concerned about the ratepayer impact, but we want to make sure that the utilities are clear on the fact that approval through the Wildfire Mitigation Plan process does not in any way change their required showing in the general rate case and what they have to prove there. We've seen that in the resolutions that have come out and the decisions that have come out. We've heard that from Arthur today, but we're just going to continue to repeat it, that this does not change the fact that they're going to have to make a just and reasonableness showing in the general rate case. And I think that it's still very important for the risk-spend efficiency and for the dollars to be shown here, because our concern is that for every dollar that is spent, there is an optimal amount of safety risk reduced, and that every dollar of ratepayer money that is being spent in the best way possible to provide the most risk mitigation and wildfire mitigation. And so for that reason, you have to necessarily include the dollars here. I will note that in terms of the RSE, we think it's really important to make sure that it is consistent across the CPUC and the WSD proceedings, specifically the SMAP and the ramps and these proceedings, and to make sure that all of the numbers are being calculated in the same way. I also would note when it comes to ratepayer impacts that I think the bill impact could be a very useful and helpful data point, but I think that it is a data point that needs to be designed and requested with specificity. Bill impact can change and vary a lot from customer to customer, depending on what rate they're on, their usage. And so to the extent that that is being used to judge the Wildfire Mitigation Plan in any way, we need to be very clear and specific about the bill impact that's being looked at. Next, I wanted to kind of generally speak about metrics, and we'll address this more in our comments. But we believe that there is a difference between targets and metrics. Program targets are really important for judging progress towards a goal of completion. Metrics, however, are something that is actually measuring the safety or the success that is achieved through reaching those program targets. So it's very important to treat them separately and to define metrics narrowly and with specificity, or sometimes broadly, but to be very precise in the way that we're defining our metrics and what their metrics are being used to do. Otherwise, to be clear that they are program targets. This is another place where consistency across the CPUC proceedings and the WSD is really important, because there's other places where ongoing work related to metrics is occurring. We would point to the PG&E bankruptcy was included a discussion of metrics. Some of the safety culture assessments that are occurring at the Commission have included within scope some discussion of metrics. The SMAP 2 proceeding that has just been opened includes a discussion of metrics. And so this is a place where it's going to require a lot of work to ensure that they're properly designed and consistent with other work ongoing at the Commission. So I think there, to the extent possible, it would be great to have a working group or another workshop where those people that are most knowledgeable about metrics, those that have been on the different working groups related to metrics, can be present to talk about it. Then finally, I wanted to say that we really appreciate that the PSPS is being pulled apart and looked at separately as its own section. I have a lot of concerns about PSPS being treated as a mitigation or being consistently relied on again and again as a mitigation rather than other work occurring and PSPS being treated as the last resort. And so for that reason, we think it's really important, as the WSD pointed out in its resolutions, to include all the indirect consequences of a PSPS in the calculation of its risk-spend efficiency, so that the Commission and the WSD is really highlighting the impact that it has on ratepayers. And I think we will, of course, be providing additional, more specific comments in our written comments, but those are sort of our broad pieces of feedback at this point.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you very much. All points well taken. And I will say that, you know, in our conditional approval of the WMPs from 2020, we really needed the utilities to come back and do a better job on RSE. I mean, that's part of the compliance plans, right? So we're hoping that we don't have to do that again, that we'll work that out, and that'll be built into the beginning. Joe, you're trying to sabotage us. And just on your point on metrics, you can be assured and be aware that WSD is now meeting with all of the other parts of the Commission, right, that are working on metrics, right, in order to get consistent nomenclature, right, to have a central place where all of the different sections that are working on metrics can access the data that the other sections are collecting to avoid duplication and to improve their ability to use that data. And, you know, I will note that we're expecting to see a rate-making proceeding that carries the SMAP forward, right? It's the risk-based rate-making that all of that derived from. We're going to be seeing a new version of that. I think it was introduced in July by the Commission, and continued work on metrics is one of those things. So hopefully that's a good forum for it.
Yes, comments on that rulemaking are actually due next week. So
yeah, so
that work is ongoing.
I'm trying to keep my eyes on it. Right. Okay, great.
Thank you.
All right, I'd like to, thank you. I'd like to move on to Joseph Mitchell, who's with Mussey Grade Road Alliance, for your insights. And Robert, can you make sure that Joseph is available?
Will do, Arthur. Joseph, can we wait until we get your line open?
Okay.
Okay, go ahead.
All right. How's my sound now? Is it okay from this distance, or should I hold the phone?
Oh, it's excellent. Thank you.
Okay, great. Good morning. I'm Joseph Mitchell, expert witness for Mussey Grade Road Alliance. Mussey Grade Road Alliance, if you haven't heard of it, been working on wildfire safety issues at the Commission since 2006. and we're actively involved in the 2019 and 2020 WMP reviews. Comments on the progress in the proposal. I think there's been some pretty tremendous progress going from nothing through the 2019 WMPs to the 2020. I think we're getting a lot of maturity very fast, and the Wildfire Safety Division should be commended for that. I think the scoping for this year's goals is good. It's ambitious. I think just in general on the process, I think we'd like to see a little bit more formality on process improvement, finding out what works, what doesn't, what needs to be improved. We'd like to, a couple of ways to do that is to circle back some. Putting in reply comments in certain cases allows us to respond to what others have said. Another thing Katie mentioned, moderated workshops where people can discuss issues. Those worked very well in some of the rulemakings. You can get through a lot of topical issues if you can divide it down into very specific things, where with a little bit of back and forth, you save yourself a tremendous amount of effort in documentation. The staff proposal under local outreach, I think adding a customer survey would be useful, specifically to find out whether utilities are adequately responding to customer complaints during PSPS. We discovered some issues with that in our own review of the PSPS. Agree with Tyson on the near-miss definitions. Will Abrams also pinged me when we were discussing that. Under the new definition, it's only something that causes smoke, and so a broken cross arm or a tree leaning against a pole wouldn't necessarily fall under the definition of near miss, when in fact those are, I would consider them near misses. Another comment regarding metrics is that with regard to the next few years, it's going to take a long time to accumulate enough data on outcome metrics like area burned, fatalities, and major catastrophic fires, because those tend to be tail events. They tend to be driven by small statistics, and so you have very big statistical fluctuations. So it can be many years or even decades before you could really make any sort of quantitative conclusion about this utility has more bad fires than another utility. That's why I think for the next few years it's really important to narrow down on the ignitions, the outages, and the near misses or near ignitions as it gets defined. I think that's something that needs to be understood. Other things needing review, capability maturity model. There's not a lot of discussion of that this year. We pointed out a number of issues with it. There are some places where it's kind of raw and lacks domain relevance. In meteorology and weather, some of the questions are weak. And in others, things are just not adequately tied to the maturity. So the maturity of the utility doesn't really correspond or is even inversely proportional to the score that a utility would get on the capability maturity model. So having some review over that is important, because if you wait till 2023 to fix that, then some of these things that you're trying to collect are important, and you've just thrown out 3 years of data. Incorporation of weather data, I think we need to make sure that is included to understanding how to handle red flag warning days, the interpretation of the 95%, 99% wind maxima that the utilities are providing. They seem to have very different methodologies for doing that, and they're not really producing consistent results. And also one thing that we bring up all the time is having a wind resilience metric so that you can tie your outcomes, tie your outages, your ignitions, and to the wind speed. I think from just jumping ahead to the GIS, I think the fact that nearest weather stations included is a big step forward there. And then just regarding the GIS proposal, I know that's going to be addressed tomorrow. Looking at the schema, haven't really dug into it yet, but overall it looks very good, looks complete. It's ambitious, making me wonder whether the utilities are going to be able to deliver on it in an immediate time frame. The one concern I would have with the GIS is that it become publicly available when it's released by the utilities. I don't know when WSD is going to have a public portal available, or whether, what the plans are around that. If WSD can't provide public versions of the GIS databases, I asked them to request that the utilities be required to make those available to the public at the same time that they're released to WSD. So those were the issues that I had. Thanks very much for the opportunity to participate, and we're looking forward to getting our comments in and continuing to work with WSD and other parties.
Joe, thank you very much. I appreciate your specificity and your attention to detail, and we'll take all of this into consideration. I will mention the maturity model is not really part of the WMP, but it is an evaluation that we hoped would give us a lot of good information and would be able to help track progress going forward. One of the reasons it's not being addressed here today is because, personally, WSD feels that it really needs a very detailed renovation, but if we do that, then we may lose the ability to compare last year with next year, right? So expect that we'll be working on that in the future. We will probably have a forum in which to talk about that specifically. There are a lot of questions that were asked, and I know that from our point of view, it was hard for staff to come back and actually vet what the utilities had given to us. And that, to me, is something that we really need to work on, right? Our ability to verify what the utilities are telling us about where they are and where they expect to be. So that just was a little bit more work for me this time, right? But we hope to get to it. Great. And then finally, on our respondents panel, Henry Burton with Public Advocates. So Robert, can you turn Henry's microphone on?
Hello, Henry. Can you go ahead and give us a sound check, please?
Hi. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, sir.
Great. Let me know if the audio is not good. All right. Arthur, thank you for inviting me to speak today. I'm glad to have the opportunity to comment on the staff proposals. And I'll share a few thoughts. It's been a heck of a busy week, so I haven't had as much time as I would like to really think about these, and so my comments may not be, highly ordered, but I'll give you what I've got. So I have a few overarching thoughts. And first of all, I think we should consider what's the difference between an update to a WMP and a new plan. I know the utilities had been directed to submit new updates in 2021 and new plans in 2023. And so I think we should consider, what the difference would be. One thing I think is that an update should show and explain what's changed from the previous year. So, for example, if a utility had been forecasting to do 100 miles every year of covered conductor installation in Tier 3, and now they're forecasting to do 300 miles every year, I would hope that the update would call out that difference and explain it. So that's one thing I think should be important. Another point is I think there probably is some room for streamlining, as Tyson was mentioning. The Public Advocate's Office made some suggestions in our comments on the WMPs back in April for information that didn't seem to be critical. And so where there's information that isn't terribly useful, then perhaps we can trim that out, at least in the updates, and perhaps it would be included in the new plan submissions in 2023. Another key point is comparability of the data, which I think comes through in the WSD staff proposal. We need to be really clear about what we're measuring so that the data is comparable across utilities and meaningful. So with all the tables and metrics, we need to have the same concept, same measurement technique, and then we'll get comparable data. I'd also like to see in the 2021 submissions more insight into the utilities' decision-making. So for 2020, what we saw was a lot of detail about what the utilities are doing, but less insight into why. For example, we noted in our comments in April that we'd like to see more information about key personnel and equipment constraints that affect their program decisions. Which programs could be scaled up, which ones can't. How are those resource issues affecting the utilities' decisions about programs? And we'd also like to see more information about the risk-based decision-making and how that applies to each program, which WSD called for in the remedial compliance plans. I think Edison's remedial compliance plan provides a useful template of walking through how they're applying risk-based decision-making in every initiative in the WMP. So I think that type of information should be integrated into all the future WMP submissions. I'd also agree with Joe Mitchell that the major outcomes are going to take a long time to manifest. So we do need to look at ignitions and near misses. We also need to think about whether modeled risk scores can provide an indication of progress. If the utility is using modeling to estimate their levels of risk, and if they're using consistent methodology over time, then we can look at how their modeled risk scores are changing and hopefully going down. We heard several comments about near misses today, and from what I heard, it sounds like it might be useful actually to have two different categories of near miss: the narrower definition that WSD has proposed and a broader definition, so that we are getting at the key concepts. Okay. I have a few more specific comments, and feel free to let me know when we're running short on time. So as I mentioned, I think it's important to have in the 2021 update a comparison to 2020, what's changing, why, both in terms of outputs like miles of covered conductor installed and spending. So, if the utility is saying, we've concluded we can do more covered conductor, and so we're going to expand that budget and do more miles, but we're also going to do less of undergrounding, for example. We'd like to see that identified and called out. Also in the section on spending of section 3 of the staff proposal, I want to note, as I think several parties have before, that risk spend efficiencies at a program level are not particularly helpful. They don't really tell you much about decision-making or prioritization. So suppose you have a risk spend efficiency for covered conductor, and suppose you have 3 equal-sized covered conductor projects that you could do. We're just going to use cost-effectiveness ratios for illustration. Obviously, that's not exactly the same as a risk spend efficiency ratio, but suppose you have a benefit cost ratio for one project of 1.4. For the second project, you have a benefit cost ratio of 1.0, so it's a perfect break even. And then the third project is 0.5. That one's not so great. Now, the first project is a very efficient way to reduce risk. Second one, take it or leave it. Third one, not so great. But if you lump it all together, the whole program has a cost-effectiveness ratio slightly below 1, which tells you that covered conductor is not very effective. I mean, this is not informative, it's not helpful. So at a minimum, we need to disaggregate the risk-spend efficiency by HFTD tiers. What is the covered conductor risk-spend efficiency in HFTD Tier 3 versus Tier 2 versus the rest of the service territory? Ideally, we should disaggregate more than that and look at different tranches of work. The first tranche of work is going to be the stuff that has the most impact. And then we look at the next tranche of work, which might have a somewhat lower risk-spend efficiency. That's going to tell you actually how much you should do before you start to back off of that program. For control programs, I think some utilities describe them as fundamental programs or enabling programs. I think we should aim to estimate a marginal risk-spend efficiency. So the idea being, if you increased or decreased your spending on that control program by 5%, how would that affect your risk? Spend 5% more, does that improve your risk? If you spend 5% less, does that create more risk? And that's a way that you can estimate a risk-spend efficiency for that type of program. Also, on page 9 of the staff proposal, it talks about increases in electric costs due to wildfires. And I think we'll need to be a lot more specific about what electric costs you mean. That's a broad concept, and when the Public Advocate's Office has tried to put numbers on that, it's quite difficult. So which wildfire costs are included? Do we include third-party claims? Do we include costs that are in memo accounts that are not yet deemed recoverable? Do we include insurance costs? Do we include the bond charges for the State Wildfire Fund? That's a very broad concept. Kind of similarly, when you talk about numbers of fatalities and injuries, you'll need to be very specific about the definitions and require the utilities to identify their sources for those. So fatality counts are fairly contentious. If you take the Camp Fire as an example, just because the Camp Fire has the most fatalities, you can, for the Camp Fire, CAL FIRE identified 85 fatalities. The Butte County DA subtracted one that was apparently a suicide, so they had a number of 84. After CAL FIRE stopped counting, several months later, another person died in the hospital, so that makes 86. Then the LA Times identified 50 more people whose deaths were linked to the fire, so potentially 136. Just depending on who you ask, you can get very different numbers for the same fire. For injuries, that problem is all the much greater because injuries are going to be harder to count than fatalities. I mean, fatalities in principle should be the simplest thing to count. And so I would really like to know how many people were injured in a fire, but I have serious doubt that any tally of wildfire-related injuries is going to be meaningful. Essentially, I think the more you dig, the more injuries you're going to find. So what kind of process is a utility supposed to use to identify injuries related to a wildfire? It will be very difficult to obtain meaningful and comparable data.
Henry, thank you very much. I really appreciate that. And we'll point out really that the methodology for doing the risk spend efficiency at the level that you're talking about really needs to be worked out in the ramps and possibly refined in this new proceeding that the Commission is going forward. And we want to be able to incorporate that at the level that makes sense in the WMPs. Your point is well taken, is that one project or one initiative can be very different than the same project in a different location, under different circumstances, that kind of thing. It's just a matter of what can we possibly get that helps us with the overall Wildfire Mitigation Plan evaluation. So we'll keep that in mind and hopefully contribute to the coordination and the use of the constantly changing evaluations that are coming out of the ramps. You know, we haven't even had a full ramp that's done this yet. I think PG&E has now become the default first guinea pig for the new settlement methodology because the separate utilities got a deferral on the change in the rate base cycle. So this is not overnight stuff. This is going to take a while to develop, but points well taken. So thank you. Right, I have 2 minutes before we're scheduled for a break, and so thank you all very much. If you had responses to each other, send emails, right? And we look forward to your written comments, especially in response to the issues that you raised and other things that you may not have had time to go into. Let's just see if there's any real pressing question coming in from the chat, and unfortunately, I won't have time to open up to the floor. Brian, Coco?
Hey, Arthur. I've been addressing questions or answering questions in the chat as I can. So at this moment, I think most of the questions have been answered, so we can probably proceed to our first break.
Okay, just Coco, is there anything that everybody should know about? I mean, like a major question that you want to flag?
No, not particularly. We had some dialogue around the near-miss issue, and I encouraged folks to ensure that their comments that they submit on August 26th address any of those relevant issues. And then a comment came in, or comment/question from Kevin Collins regarding the WSD not possessing inventory of conductor types and ages. And I alerted Mr. Collins that our current draft data reporting standards require quite a bit of information around conductor types, sizes, ages, and I encouraged him to review that. So that was kind of it.
Great. Thank you very much, and thank you all. We're going to take a 10-minute break, come back here at, 11:21 your time. John Maynard from the Wildfire Safety Advisory Board is up next. I don't know how to do this, John. I want to make sure that you connect with Robert so that you're all audio connected and that you'll be running your own slideshow, I presume. Otherwise, I have it here on my computer and I can run it when you tell me to change the slides. So let's try and figure out a way to communicate amongst ourselves. Again, thank you all very much. This has been very useful for me, very useful for WSD, and I hope useful for yourselves.
Hey, Arthur, this is Ryan. If you don't mind, please put up the slide that has the agenda and set the beginning of the slide deck for our break, and then we'll resume back at 11:20.
Can you see it?
Not yet.
If not, no. Okay, so I'm not.
Hello, this is Wendy. I just wanted to test. Am I being heard?
Yes, we can hear you, Wendy.
Okay, great, because I need to be available for the next panel. Thank you.
Okay, I'm not able.
And I would love to be able to do my, this is John Mader. I'd like to be able to flip through the slides, so I'll share my screen when it's appropriate.
All right. Something's wrong. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. We really appreciate you're joining us for the second portion of the first day of the Wildfire Safety Division's workshop on potential changes to the Wildfire Mitigation Plan evaluation for 2021. We're going to be taking a look at a proposal that came out of the Wildfire Safety Advisory Board report that I referenced previously for a system hardening for electric utility resiliency standard that could be a useful means for identifying when things like PSPS might be necessary and how changes in the utilities mitigations can change the threshold. I'm going to turn it over to John Mader, who is going to describe what this is, and then there'll be a discussion afterwards, and we'll do our best to try and open it up to questions before we close out at 1 o'clock. So you'll be hearing from me again at about 12:45. John, take it away.
All right. Thank you very much, Arthur. And I really appreciate this opportunity to put these recommendations into more context for everybody. So I've got 23 years of experience as an electrical utility engineer. 15 years of that experience has been doing the capacity and reliability planning for Amador and Calaveras counties, which are right in the middle of the high fire threat district area. So, I've got a lot of experience and expertise regarding how to design these types of electric utility grids. And so these recommendations are based on that experience. So the Wildfire Safety Advisory Board, amongst other duties, advises the Wildfire Safety Division regarding the Wildfire Mitigation Plan guidelines. As Arthur mentioned, in June, the Wildfire Safety Advisory Board made a number of recommendations, and we're going to discuss 2 of those recommendations today. Now, those recommendations are from my perspective as a utility engineer. What would the tools that I would need to have in order to design the utility grid to both reduce the chances of the risk of wildfire initiation, but also reduce the reliance on PSPS. And I think we heard earlier from many of the respondents, but that is something that is really strong interest of all the parties involved. So like I said, I really appreciate this opportunity, and we're just going to get right into the presentation right now. So if we could go to the second slide, please.
Robert, is there a way to get the slide to be in the whole screen? I'm seeing videos, and I'm just seeing one little corner for the presentation.
Yes, Arthur, I'm going to work on that.
All right. So during this presentation, we're going to do an introduction about what the concept of the sure threshold is. I've got a much longer concurrence that I filed with that report that goes into much more detail, but what I have found that coming up with an illustrative example, like how this would practically work, is sometimes the best way of communicating this concept. So that's going to be the meat of what we're going to be discussing next day. And then we're going to discuss, we'll have Q&A and discuss potential next steps. Next slide, please. So the objectives of these 2 recommendations, and I want to stress, and we'll see that in a slide later, that they were meant to be compatible and concurrent with each other, is to develop a methodology for determining risk reduction and a system hardening for electric utility threshold, basically a safety threshold. Now, if this is done at the IOU standards or if it's done at the WSD, the goal is to be able to develop these criteria so that they're transparent, so that we can compare apples to apples and oranges to oranges. And then we want to be able to develop, that will enable the WSD to develop capacity, determine if specific mitigation expenditures are the most cost-effective and requiring the IOUs to consider both wildfire risk and PSPS risk in their mitigation projects. And, I think that there's growing awareness that, PSPS is not, a desirable mitigation, that it has its own inherent risks. And that's at the heart of these two recommendations, which is to treat both wildfire and PSPS as a risk, as not a desired state. Next slide, please. So these are the recommendations that were in the report. Separately, they don't add up to the goal of reducing both wildfire risk and PSPS, but combined, where you develop the tools and then you require the utilities to do the risk and efficiency calculations to determine what is the best resource allocation to achieve both goals. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. So why is this necessary? Well, right now, there's no clear regulatory standards about how IOUs identify and quantify wildfire risk. And there's no established acceptable level of operational risk before utilities should assume before initiating a PSPS. There's work being done, but at the time that the recommendations were made, there wasn't any standards being established. Next slide. So this is where we're going to get into a specific example. We're going to come out with a model of a distribution system. I want to be clear that the methodology that we're going to use in order to demonstrate the idea of a sure net standard and the idea of having quantified risk reduction and using those tools to drive good economic decisions about where best to place projects. The methodology that I'm going to be used is not a recommendation of that methodology. There are other ways to do this that may be superior. It's just that it's easier to explain this concept if we use an actual system. So that's what we're going to do today. The transmission system in this example is not modeled, except that it's not rated for very high winds, for very high winds. The exclusion of the transmission system doesn't mean that this concept is limited solely to distribution. It may very well be that after these tools are developed, that as you're doing these risk-spend efficiency calculations and you're doing the analysis of what are the superior projects, that it could be the transmission system is where the money needs to go first. So don't take it that we're not including the transmission system as an exclusion that this concept shouldn't be applied to both the transmission system as well. Next slide, please. All right, so for our illustrative example, we're coming up with a very, very simple system. The purple triangle is our substation. That's our distribution substation. The entire area, and I want to stress that as we're looking at this, we are looking at project and location-specific analysis tools to determine what is the best possible mitigation to be applied to the grid. We're not talking about programmatically. We're not talking about, covered conductor in its aggregate. We're talking about the specific application of mitigations on the distribution system or the transmission system to determine, what gets us the most wildfire risk reduction, and also potentially with a sure standard, it allows us to be able to apply those mitigations so as to reduce our reliance on PSPS events, which, I heard earlier, I think Katie mentioned that, those should be the last resort. Yes, they're the backstop. So what can we do in order to engineer the system to be able to be resilient enough to be safely operated in weather conditions which normally would have resulted in a PSPS event? And so to demonstrate that, we have this simple system. We've got an entirely wooded area. It's only got 4 segments, like one span of uncovered conductor, overhead, 40-foot poles, low pole height. Then it's serving the customer. Then it goes to the goes down a riser, goes into underground, serves another customer. There's a switch. When the underground rises up on another pole, it goes through a wooded area with no customers. And lastly, it goes into a wooded area which serves with an overhead conductor serving one customer. So that's our defined system. Let's go to the next slide. So in order to be able to do the planning for specific circuits at specific geographical areas, we're going to need to have, as an engineer, I'm going to need to have a projected how many wind events are will the circuit experience and potentially cause there to be high risk events. And then I need to look at specifically geographically, what are the consequences of a wildfire initiation at a specific location where the circuits are. In this case, since we're such a small circuit, all the consequences are the same, but it's conceivable that, a very long circuit could have different wind, different weather, or different consequences based on what part of the circuit and where it is. So this specific circuit is projected during the season during the summer seasons where there's a high risk of wildfires. It's projected to experience one very high wind event, three high wind events, and all other times it's going to be low. Now, this is one of those tools that we need to work with the data scientists and the forestry people to be able to come up with these kind of projection tools. I've got one of my colleagues, Wildfire Safety Advisory, Jessica Block, will address this a little bit in her response. But these are those tools that I was talking about where, as an engineer, I need to know in order to design the system. If you go back to that slide, please. Thank you. And so the consequence of mapping here is, it's projected that during low winds, there's low consequence because there's fire suppression that's projected to be able to respond sufficiently to be able to keep this fire from spreading and causing a lot of destruction. But during high wind events and very high wind events, that's when the circuit is projected during any one of these segments. If there is a fire, it'll be probably a high consequence fire. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. So this is another key tool that needs to be developed in some form, which is an asset risk methodology. And in this one, we've got a table where we've got the asset, and then we've got a series of attributes that we think, as they change, can affect the risk profile of that specific kind of asset. And then finally, the weather, the surrounding area is another type of attribute that changes the risk. And finally, the wind profile. So, and the risk is defined in wildfires per unit of asset per operational hour. So whatever the risk of this particular asset, if we have a unit risk profile for it, we can determine X amount of asset times that unit. It's going to give us a projected amount of wildfires per operational hour. So that's something that we can use to project the number of wildfires that comes from our system. Obviously, this would be in reality, this would be an extremely complicated chart with thousands and thousands of different permutations. And so it's a big endeavor to develop something like this, but these aren't an infinite number of possibilities. So it is possible that this could be developed, maybe based on projections, maybe based on operational history. But in this case, because we're trying to get a concept across, we're going to go with a very, very simplified version where we only have 3 different types of asset. We've got overhead. All different types of uncovered conductor are reduced to just overhead, underground, overhead, and covered. Now, these numbers are blanked out because I don't want, we shouldn't be concentrating on the numbers or like the equations, because once again, we're not making the recommendations on a specific methodology. But I think it's pretty clear that if you look at an overhead conductor and you look at the type of construction, there is triangular construction where the phases are 18 inches apart. It's in some parts where a branch only has to be 2 feet long in order to conduct, if it flies up into the conductor, in order to contact both of those phases and get ignited. That's a much higher chance than, say, normal construction, which uses a 6-foot cross arm. Or it's even less if you were to use a 9-foot cross arm or a 12-foot cross arm where they're spaced out further apart. You can see where that would affect the risk. Same thing with pole height, same kind of concept. A lower pole is more likely to be within a forest canopy, so there's much more chance of a tree branch making contact, or if or branches flying, and there's much more chances of them making contact with the conductor. Whereas if it's a higher pole, say a 70-foot pole or something like that, where it may be above the canopy, that would lower the risk. And then topography, I could have put in a ton of different types of attributes for topography, but we wanted to simplify this down to as much as possible. If you've got wooded topography, which is as you've got your standard GEO 95 clearances, and some state that I'm calling enhanced vegetation management, where the vegetation is cleared out much farther away, say 15 feet in all direction, where highly dangerous species of trees that can fall into the line are removed within the distance of being able to fall into the line. We're calling that enhanced vegetation management, and that would have a lesser risk. And then, for the purposes of this analysis, we're not talking about gusts or sustained. We're just talking about the concept of low wind, high wind, and very high wind. So, like, I'm surrounded by overhead conductor all through my neighborhood where I'm talking to you from right now. There is low wind. The utility has deems that it is perfectly acceptable to run the system because we have a very low wind event. But if the wind becomes higher, then we've got to start looking at whether or not a public power shutdown is necessary, or even if it gets very high, and that's going to be important for the concept of where to apply mitigations. We can go to the next slide, please. So if we analyze the circuit for the risks that we're talking about from wildfire and PSPS, if we use our SURE risk chart, the quantified risk chart, we can develop an wildfire incident rate for each one of those line segments during low, high, and very high wind events. It should be noted that, as I mentioned in the beginning of the illustrative example, the transmission line is not rated to be able to be safely run during very high wind events, over 55 miles an hour. So that it's not going to, the circuit's not going to experience a very high wind event risk situation because it's going to be de-energized because the source of the power will be de-energized. It's also that during low wind events, it's not projected to be capable of high consequence fires. That's also important to note. And then, so the incident rates on segments 1, 3, and 4, those were the overhead, the segments that had overhead conductor. If we use our SURE risk chart, we're able to get out a projected incident rate, and during high wind events, where the circuit could potentially be energized because the transmission is still energized, it's determined that they're above the SURE threshold, the SURE safety threshold that is part of this recommendation, and they are going to have to be de-energized as part of the PSPS during high wind events. So the results are, for this particular circuit, if we're able to develop that quantitative risk chart, we're able to come up with weather projections, we're able to calculate out what are the number of projected wildfires that this circuit is going to have, how many of those are going to be high consequence, how many of those are going to be low consequence. And also, we're going to be able to project out the number of PSPS experiences. In this case, we're going to have 3 high wind events where where it's projected that the circuit is going to go above the SURE threshold, and 1 wind event where it's going to go above the SURE threshold for the transmission. So total, there's going to be 12 PSPS experiences. 3 people are going to experience 4 PSPSs each. Okay, so that's our analysis of the existing circuit. Let's go to the next page. Slide, please. So if we know what the risk is for each specific type of construction and each specific type of topography and the risk that can be reduced through other mitigations such as enhanced vegetation management, then we can alter that system and we can change the risk profile and we can change the projected number of wildfires and even potentially avoid some PSPS events by the application of, by using investments in enhanced vegetation management or other constructions. And so for the purposes of this example, we're going to assign some costs to the different types of construction techniques that are available to us. All right, so let's go to the next slide. So we're going to use these concepts of quantified risk reduction, a safety threshold, and risk spend efficiency calculations to analyze 2 different potential projects to change the risk profile for this specific circuit. Project 1, we're going to look at raising up the poles from those 40-foot poles to the 70-foot poles so that the lines are above the canopy of the forest, and we're going to look at potentially applying covered conductor. And in the Project 2, we're going to look at raising up the poles, applying enhanced vegetation management, and changing from those 6-foot cross arms out to those 9-foot or 12-foot cross arms. All right. So that's going to change the risk profile for both the circuit and both these 2 discrete examples. Let's go to the next slide. So if we do our analysis of mitigation project 1, we know the cost of raising up the poles. We know the cost of installing covered conductor. So we're able to get out a total expenditure of 7. Now, our analysis is that, we now have a new incident rate for segment 4 of the circuit. Where we look at the SURE threshold and we determine that the incident rate is low enough, even though we're in a high consequence area potentially, but it's low enough, we're below that SURE threshold, we can operate the system during during high wind events. However, segment 1 and segment 3 are still overhead conductor, uncovered, with lower poles in a wooded area, so their incident rates are above the SURE threshold. And meaning that they're going to need to be de-energized during high wind events. So segments 1 and 3 are both the sources of segment 4. So that means that every time we have a high wind event or a very high wind event, we're still going to need to shut down the entirety of the circuit. So the results are that we have 0 projected PSPS avoidance. And there will be some wildfire avoidance because during low wind events when it's operating, it does have a lower incident rate, and so that will lower the projected amount of wildfires that we can expect from this circuit. However, none of them are going to be of high consequence wildfires because the circuit is projected to be shut down during a PSPS event when the consequence mapping shows that wildfire initiation could result in a high consequence wildfire because it's not safe to operate. So what we get here is we get some wildfire avoidance, none of it of high consequence, and we get zero PSPS avoidance. And so this is a pretty low efficiency project. Okay, go to the next slide. Now, if we look at project number 2, where we applied 3 different mitigations. It's a total of 5 units of expenditure. Now, Segment 1's incident rate has been reduced, and we note that it's been reduced below the SURE threshold. Well, you know what? Segment 2 threshold was already below the SURE threshold because it's undergrounded. So both Segments 1 and 2 can now be left in power during high wind events. Even though they're in high consequence areas, the risk has been sufficiently reduced so that it's below that resiliency threshold. So that means that when we're going to both reduce wildfires and potentially we're going to reduce the risk of high consequence wildfires, we're also going to be able to reduce some PSPS experiences, because during high wind events, not very high wind events, remember the transmission system is going to go out, but during high wind events, we're going to be able to operate the circuit. We're going to be able to keep 2 customers in power for three PSPSs that they would have otherwise have experienced. So the results are we get projected PSPS avoidance of 3 people will avoid 3 PSPSs, so that's 9. And we also we're projected to get X amount of wildfire avoidance, as well as it's going to be a high consequence. So we get both wildfire avoidance and we get high consequence wildfire avoidance, and we get PSPS avoidance. So this is a very high efficiency project. Okay, if we go to the next slide. So that's, project 1, we didn't avoid any high consequence wildfires. We didn't avoid any PSPS events. Project 2, we reduced the number of PSPS events by 75%. And we're also able to, since it's going to operate during high wind events, we're going to get the reduction of the projected amount of high consequence wildfires. So obviously, Project 2 is more efficient. We can go to the next slide, please. So I mentioned that I cut my teeth as an engineer doing the planning for Amador and Calaveras County. I'm very intimately aware with these rural counties and the way that their road systems work and the way their water distribution systems work and the sewer systems. And I want to note here, if you look at Amador County, this is the west side here is Sacramento County. PG&E's electrical utility system runs up to right about Cook Station, which is about 2/3 through the county. And if we look at the section in the middle, that's from Cider Creek to down south of Jackson, we're talking about a 7-mile stretch of road. Inside of that section there, you've got the county seat, you've got the county hospital. You can see here that most of the emergency planning is centered around this area. This is the heart of the county. And if we go to the next slide. This is what it looks like satellite. So you can see that it's actually in the middle of a rural county, but this 7-mile section is kind of semi-urban. It's probably has a different risk profile, and if you were able to concentrate wildfire mitigations in this particular area, you could potentially lower the risk sufficiently so that it could be in power during high wind events. I note right here in the gold star here, that's a substation. It runs off the sub-transmission, which is rated to be able to be safely operated at wind speeds above what the distribution system is. So if you're able to bring the distribution system up to the transmission system, then potentially what you could do here is you could keep this section of the county in power during wind events that otherwise it would have to experience a PSPS event, if you were able to develop the SURE safety threshold. And if we could go back a slide. I want to note that hopefully you guys can see my, you can't see my cursor. If you look, Robert, you see a little NC, see Plymouth to the north of that circle? You're in the eastern part of the county there. Yeah, there, keep going. No. Okay, so that's actually Pine Grove right there. There's a substation there. there's a substation in Ione, there's a substation along the river, and there's one right in Martell between Sutter Creek and Jackson, and there's a substation in Plymouth. If you look topographically at these areas, you'll see that it's Plymouth, Ione, and the Martell, Sutter-Jackson area that are probably most successful candidates for being able to develop these concentrated mitigations to build a sure zone that would be able to lower the risk of wildfires potentially to the level that it would be safe to operate during high wind events. If we can go down 2 slides. So that 7-mile section, it's a tiny section of the total circuit miles in the county, but in that section, there's a significant percentage of the population of the county. It's number of the major employers and services are in this section. We can go to the next slide. When we've heard that Southern California Edison and PG&E are roughly going to be doing around 100 miles of covered conductor, and I mentioned that that's a 7-mile section. There's initially, as one of the things that we need to consider is that we're not going to be able to go out and do all the areas that are potentially sure zones, and there's going to have to be some priority that's going to be developed, has to be developed for where we're going to be able to, if we develop this sure threshold and quantified risk reduction, we're going to need to look at where are we going to prioritize applying these mitigations. I think that we need to provide the IOUs with some guidance. And we're going to need to look at, how we don't want to just put it in affluent neighborhoods. We need to look at the impact on disadvantaged communities, environmental justice issues, and of course the county services and municipal services. That's why it's so applicable in that particular area of Amador County. But we're going to need to identify all those areas, and like for instance, Rossmore and Walnut Creek is, while some of it is in a high fire threat district area, they've got access to services much easier than say the Amador County when the entire county is out of power. Folks have got to drive down to Stockton. That's an hour-and-a-half drive or longer, and it would be a much different experience. Even if those folks that are in the county are experiencing PSPS events, if they can drive over to Jackson and receive services and supplies and get gasoline in their vehicles, that's going to make a much bigger difference. And so that's something else that I think we're going to need to consider if we develop these concepts. But if we do develop these quantified risk reductions for the different types of topography, the different types of utility asset, and we develop that sure threshold, then we're talking apples and apples and oranges, and you can see where the potential for the CPUC or the WSD to be able to transparently be able to judge, specific wildfire mitigation projects, and the IOUs would be able to provide, here is the number of wildfires I'm projected to avoid by this expenditure. Here is the number of PSPSs that I'm going to be able to avoid. If you look at that project 1, it's not a great project. It's because the power is going to be shut down during the high risk wind events anyway. If you're going to do mitigations out in hill and dale, away from where the population and the substation, it's really not a great expenditure. These are tools that are going to be able to help the utilities to be able to report transparently the value of the projects that they're making at a circuit level. Go to the next slide. So I just basically said what this says right here is making it a process for the utilities to transparently be able to determine those projects, show that value and enable the WSD and other bodies such as the CPUC to be able to judge and be able to determine whether or not the utilities are maximizing the benefits to the people of California from the investments that they're making. The next slide. So I want to, we're going to turn in a moment to some responders. I really want to thank everybody that is going to be joining us today. My colleague from the Wildfire Safety Advisory, Jessica Block, is going to be starting off, but I also appreciate having the participation and the comments from Henry Burton from the California Public Advocate's Office, Katie Morsoni from TURN, Wendy Al-Muqdad from the Safety Policy Division, and lastly, PG&E's John Fullman. We, made this presentation to all of them, and I'm really looking forward to their thoughtful comments, and appreciate Arthur Dale inviting me to give me the opportunity to be able to provide these recommendations with more context.
Okay, John, is Jessica going to be first up?
Yes, please.
Okay, Robert, can we make sure that Jessica is available to talk?
Hello, this is Robert from CPUC. Jessica, can we test your line, please?
Testing. Can you hear me?
Sounds good.
Great. Okay. John, thank you so much for your thoughtful presentation. I think this is a really well laid out structure for how data-driven informed decision-making can be made transparent and can be dynamic based on different variables, including seasons and different aspects of circuit maintenance and infrastructure maintenance and even other management actions. What you're describing, which I thought was really helpful in your example, was that there's hundreds or thousands or more of all of these conditional dependencies. So if X, then Y. If A, B, and C, then Q. And so I see this as a really excellent example for building a use case for designing what we would call a data model. A data model organizes elements of data and standardizes how they relate to one another, and work with the Wildfire Safety Division's vision and their new data strategy, which was written up in their Appendix 3 of the roadmap documentation that they published. And so, the data strategy is this vision for transparency in the data. And what you're proposing here is not just what might help define requirements in the data reporting, but how we might be able to structure the data and the relationships to it to provide these effective analyses and be able to streamline the process. And so I'm excited about a next step towards talking with the Wildfire Safety Division on how we could use this as a first use case to build those data models and their data strategy. I think doing so will help us build a structure for effective analysis. There's so much we have to learn as we move forward in this. I know that there are degrees of subjectivity that have been necessary in the infrastructure maintenance in the past, and some of that has been by necessity. And, as California is a leader in science and technology, we can start setting the standards for how we structure this data so we can monitor how the environment is changing and how the different service territories are different, and what these different, and understanding conditional dependencies that maybe we hadn't discovered before. So, as this might be a complex front-loaded effort, it should allow for making things more efficient and streamlined in the future and allowing us to adapt into the future. Yeah, I think this is a methodology that allows for clearly defining a data repository that can be made strategically useful. And it allows for opportunities for continuous improvement as well. So I think that's all I have to say here. I'm looking forward to working with the utilities insights on this and the safety division to see how we can help build these data models and data structures to help make these sorts of analyses a reality.
Thank you, Jessica. Your comments remind me that, as we build this risk tool and as it relates to projected wind events and consequence mapping, that it can really be a potential to inform how the system is operated. For instance, if a wind is going in one direction, it's potentially that we could have, it could be a non-consequence, high consequence, or whereas if the wind changes, it could change the level of consequence in that particular area, which would, arguably be able to help with the decisions over whether or not to have a PSPS or to where to maybe allocate fire suppression assets. But yeah, it's one. If we develop this tool, it can help in other areas that we're looking for improvements in the wildfire mitigation plans.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to note that if we look at the history of utility maintenance and the history of failures or even near misses, there's a lot of missing data in that, like, we don't know how the environment's going to change or how the vegetation growth over time is going to influence its interaction with the way the environment's going to change. And so we need to allow for that openness to see where we're going to be hitting the unknowns or the new discoveries as we go. We can't, we know that we're going to have to be flexible and to learn as we go. So this is excellent. Thank you.
Thank you. So Henry Burton from the California Public Utility Advocates Office.
Hi, are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, then I will go ahead. I just have a few comments. First of all, I want to thank John for developing and presenting this concept. I really like this concept. I think it's really useful and interesting. And obviously it is a starting point, and the actual implementation would be much more detailed and would require a lot of work. But I think this approach is really useful because it actually sheds light on the decision-making and the prioritization and could help us understand what's the right prioritization of projects to get effective risk reduction and to get it quickly, to get the best projects to the front of the queue. I think the Public Advocates Office has consistently stressed that de-energization should be a last resort, and so this shows a good approach for utilities to minimize their reliance on de-energization. I'd also note that this is similar in spirit to some comments we made on SDG&E's Wildfire Mitigation Plan back in April. When we were looking at SDG&E's plan, we commented that efforts oriented to minimizing the impact of de-energization should start with community resources like schools, community centers, and John talked about being able to keep the power on for the town center even if you're forced to de-energize some of the outlying, more wooded and rural areas. That's really important because the customer experience for a de-energization is going to be really different if you can at least get electricity in a nearby town or in a friend's house. So, obviously we have particular issues this year with the pandemic and, it being difficult to go out to, say, school or a friend's house. But in theory, or in normal circumstances, if you have a shutoff in outlying areas but power's on in town, you can still go to work, you can still send your kids to school, you could go to a library or community center for air conditioning and internet, you can get ice to put in your fridge, you could get fresh food, right? So all those things are really important and change the experience for the customer. In terms of moving forward with this and implementation, I think it will require quite a bit of work, particularly how do we set the threshold that specifies what's an acceptable level of risk to continue operating the system. So this is an issue that will be really tricky, and I think it could perhaps be taken up in the new rulemaking, the SMAP rulemaking on risk-based decision-making that the Commission voted out in July. That rulemaking, that OIR identifies risk tolerance as an issue, and that seems closely related. Along with that, we'll have to think about the policy structure, the policy incentives around a risk threshold. So, what is the incentive or penalty structure for the utility to implement and follow that threshold? So, in particular, what would happen if the utility has identified that the risk is just below the threshold, so it's acceptable to continue operating the system, keeping the power on, but nonetheless there is some risk and it could happen that a fire ignites. In that case, we need to think about what the sort of policies are about responsibility for that fire. So suppose your analysis shows that it's safe to, the risk is tolerable up to 60-mile-per-hour winds, right? Up to 60-mile-per-hour winds, there's obviously risk, but you can continue to operate your system with tolerable risk. Okay. And on a particular day in October, the winds are 50 to 55 miles an hour. The utility keeps the power on, but as it happens, a branch falls on the line, starts a fire, and that could be a pretty significant fire at those wind speeds. So we need to think about what the policies are about, was that a prudent operating decision? Is the utility responsible for that fire? How do we deal with the costs of that fire?
I agree with you completely, Henry. This is obviously a very simplified example, but I did mention if you looked at the specific topography of Jackson, it has its own fire suppression assets in that area. It's got firefighting crew, stations in that area. It's potential that even though that there is the risk of a wildfire during a high wind event, there's sufficient confidence that it will be able to be contained. Or conversely, we may look at a circuit that we've never considered a PSPS event for because the wind was low, and when we do the consequent mapping and the risk calculations, we may find out that there are certain circuits where the consequences are so dire that it warrants wildfire mitigation expenditures, even though we're not thinking that it's going to avoid a PSPS event, right? So it could, we don't really have that kind of granularity, that kind of vision right now with the tools that are available to us right now. Whereas if we could develop these tools, then we could apply them in not just related to PSPS avoidance, but also high consequence fire avoidance. So yeah, I agree with you completely. I have one statement I'd like to make right now. I was supposed to make this statement in the beginning of my presentation, so I apologize for that, but I'm here. I just want to make sure that everybody knows that I'm here in my capacity as the Wildfire Advisory Board to present the two recommendations in the Wildfire Safety Advisory Board adopted in its June meeting. I'm appointed by the governor. Although I'm an employee of PG&E, my work for the board is paid for by the engineers and scientists of California rather than PG&E. So I am not here as an agent of PG&E. I'm here as an agent, I'm here as a Wildfire Safety Advisory Board member as appointed by the governor. All right. Henry, did you have any other comments you wanted to make?
Just one thing briefly. I think it's also important what you said, that the utilities could use this kind of analysis to position their firefighting resources and CAL FIRE as well. So that's another way to deal with risk, right? If you're in a situation where the risk is high, but it's still beneath the tolerable threshold, then another way to respond to that situation is to prepare for the possibility by sending firefighting resources in that direction. And that way, shutting off the power is not our only or necessary response.
Right. I agree with you. The mitigation table should include, stationing fire resources or having 24-hour fire watches on if we have a defined sure zone, the mitigation menu should be pretty wide. And when we're doing how do we solve this problem, it should be from the perspective of trying to get to the safest, most cost-effective solution and not just rely on one specific type of mitigation. Let's look at all of it and be able to, determine what's the best possible mitigation. All right. So Katie Morthoni from Turn.
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. All right. Thank you for the presentation. I wanted to start out by talking about the PG&E ramp just briefly, which I think one thing that struck Turn as we were in the PG&E ramp workshop is that there is a projected continued reliance on PSPS over the coming years. And because that we view PSPS as a last resort, as something we should be trying to avoid, that is necessarily concerning. And so I think what we like about this approach is it allows us to see, okay, right now this is our best tool for minimizing wildfire risk, but this would help us shape how a utility's plan for mitigating wildfire going forward would be shaped in order to allow for additional sectionalizing, in order to allow for these more, centers where there's some resiliency and there's some, access to electricity, et cetera, kind of highlighting those places where we can provide that for customers. So I think being used as a tool to target the work to protect customers and allowing the utility to make choices and identify high priority work to be done, we think that's really powerful. But I think we would say, as we said in the first session, that this is a place where consistency and coordination across the Wildfire Safety Division and the PUC and its other proceedings is going to be really important, be it the ramp or the SMAP too. We want to make sure that as the tool is developed, it is being used consistently and is being built in a way that it allows the utilities to use the tool, but also report what they need to report on a consistent basis across the PUC. I will say it takes me back to the early days of the SMAP and the General Rate Case Plan, where there's a lot of discussion of what our goals were. And that was that we wanted additional transparency, we wanted accountability for the utilities, and we wanted a chance for all interveners that are interested to participate in decision making. And in order for those three things to happen, I think that there has to be buy-in from everybody, one, but I also think that it's really important that we are working together so that the utilities can transfer what they know about their assets, about their resources, about their systems, and what they know about their customers, where they're critical customers, where there's greater populations, with people like you, John, who is an engineer, who can help them determine what mitigation strategies there are that can be targeted in certain places to mitigate the outcome of or I guess eliminate the use of the PSPS as much as possible. And I also would say that as Henry was talking about, Henry from Public Advocates was talking about after the first panel, this underscores the importance of granularity of understanding risk. So you need to understand our risk on a granular segment-based level. And so that's something that we need to be pursuing. And then I finally, I wanted to again highlight coordination with the SMAP too. I think your presentation asked the question, what are the minimum requirements of service? And that relates to kind of what is our risk tolerance? What are we willing to put up with? And I think that idea is going to become much more important in the second SMAP. And so I hope we can kind of move these two processes forward together. Thank you.
Thank you. I look forward to that. I did participate in the recent SMAP meeting that you presented with PG&E, and the control, the reporting, it was done at a program level, like at the, considering covered conductor as a whole, like what is the result on wildfire risk reduction. Yes, and we're talking, this concept is about going down to the specific circuit level, getting down to the specific project level. However, the aggregate of those projects can be reported programmatically, right? But if there's knowledge and there's buy-in, like you said, about what is that acceptable threshold level, then the utilities can start to engineer their system and apply those resources in a way that achieves both of those goals. So yeah, I agree with you completely. That we're going to need to have buy-in. But I'd also want to note, this is a presentation about basically reliability engineering, right? It's just basic reliability engineering. In reliability engineering, we go normal, in, minus. What happens if we take out one part of the system? What is the result? How bad is it? Do we need to have redundancy in that system? The problem is when you're looking at these PSPF events, it's in minus everything, right? So everything is out and it's all shut down. And so now you need to look at, do I need redundancy for this one thing? Or what if I build redundancy for this or that or that? Can I, with the application of a very finite, small amount of resources, leverage those mitigation projects into a benefit that's significant? Such as, I noted at the end of the projects that, that 7-mile section is probably less than, I don't have direct access to this information, but it's probably less than 1% of the circuit miles in that county. And yet you're going to provide redundancy for 10% of the population of that county. That's the kind of leveraging that we can get if you use this type of approach.
I'd like to make one respond, and I think that actually really encapsulates what Turn's hopes and goals are for risk-based decision making. Is that we have all of these, we have all of this knowledge, we have reliability planning, we have all of this, and how do we leverage the tools that we already have to address these issues in a transparent way. And I think, and we don't need to reinvent the wheel, we just need to take the wheel cover off. That's a bad metaphor, but I think I really like that. We would agree there. Let's do what we can with what we have already.
Okay. Thank you. Next to respond is Wendy Al-Muqdad from the CPUC Safety Policy Division.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, indeed.
Great. Thank you very much, John, for inviting me to speak, and thanks for meeting with me earlier. And thank you for attending. It was the PG&E RAMP 2020 RAMP workshop that you attended, and we followed up afterwards. So I'd like to kind of talk through some of the initial identified deficiencies that are relevant to the SURE threshold that the SPD, our Safety Policy Division, already issued into the proceeding July 29th, I believe. And one of them was that, as was already mentioned, PG&E is relying on PSPS as a mitigation, and Wildfire Safety Division has determined that they cannot justify doing so by RSEs because there's no societal and economic impacts and cost analysis included. So that's something we've asked. We're requesting PG&E to provide a proposal to remediate this and some other concerns. The second main concern that we found are, like you mentioned, that both the controls and the mitigations are just lacking in that they're not granular. They're at programmatic levels, and it's very problematic. So I think that, you know, as an example, I can say that in PG&E's recent ramp, they have system hardening as one of their main mitigations, but they have multiple initiatives included in that. You know, covered conductor. They have it joined with undergrounding. They have it, you know, included for pole replacements for covered conductor, and then they also have included fuse cutouts and switch replacements to CAL FIRE certified low-risk equipment, and then combined in all that is also transformer replacements with fire-resistant insulation fluid. So what's really hard is we can't tell which part of those, which part of the system hardening program is really making the biggest impact, and what is doing what. And then also, the other thing we noted is that there's some of the drivers being combined into, like, example, a third-party contact driver. There are two very different sub-drivers. One is a vehicle hitting a pole, and the other is a Mylar balloon hitting equipment or a conductor. And you'd think that those drivers would require different mitigations. So this is kind of been identified. We've identified that as a deficiency and an issue. The third main thing I actually want to talk about, because this is very relevant to what your sure threshold, is that we've basically identified that all of the high fire threat district wildfire risk tranches that are used in PG&E's recent ramp are really insufficient, because it gets to the point that, you know, they're not granular, and we need some much more granularity. We referenced that the SMAP settlement agreement requires tranches in these risk profiles to have homogeneous risk profiles, and that's not what we have now. At a very minimum, they should be divided into possibly Tier 3 and Tier 2 tranches, but they're also, right now, the three highest risk scored distribution and transmission high fire threat district tranches encompasses more than 30,000 circuit miles. So that does not allow us to at all break down, you know, what are the risk profiles. I mean, to have them, you know, combined into such large areas. And basically, you know, there are different kinds of risk, you know, equipment risk, vegetation contact risk, the circuit, you know, risk themselves, you know, and we need to really understand that more. What we've also identified is that perhaps what utilities have done in the past is they prioritize their programmatic, you know, they prioritize how they implement their programs, their system hardening, grid hardening, vegetation management. They've covered conductor programs, all these types of programs. Utilities are already prioritizing it and using different tools to prioritize it. So what we're saying is those tools that they're using to prioritize it, perhaps some of those tools need to be incorporated into this risk modeling, and you know, including, like, on the electric reliability side, as you mentioned, they do, you know, separate types of modeling where they're looking at small conductors, where they're looking at, you know, whether there's been reliability performance issues, whether there's been momentary sustained outages indicative of electrical faults. So, you know, we think that a lot of those things need to be looked at, and I think that your model really helps us give a path to do that. And the last thing that we noted in identifying the deficiencies with PG&E ramp is that regionalized or localized tranches would result in more localized wildfire mitigations, which I think is, you know, exactly kind of what you've been pointing out in example. The other thing I want to mention is that in May of 2019, myself and others, we did a Edison ramp review, and that is available on our website under risk assessment on the CPUC's website. And in that is an Appendix C with a lot of detailed analysis on some ideas and recommendations, that I believe some Edison has taken up on in their GRC, but some others we may still want to go back and look at. There's a presentation on our website that kind of narrows all these down from May of 2019, Edison Ramp Review, Appendix C presentation. And while the work we did then didn't really focus on wind, which I think is very important to be looking at wind, it was more kind of focused on power engineering aspects. And what we noticed was that in November of 2019, Edison Ramp, they did use index scores, what they called index scores, to prioritize and rank their overhead circuits for fire threat characteristics. And they used those index scores to kind of, based on historical faults in high fire threat areas, to kind of basically estimate what would be the potential number of mitigated faults if they would have had this particular, a fire threat. What could they potentially mitigate? And I do believe that Edison has used the risk curve. I haven't followed the Edison GRC, but I believe they've used the risk curve for their vegetation management work, but not their grid hardening work in their GRC. And it's something we might want to look into.
Hey, Wendy, this is Ryan Arba here. I just want to do a quick time check because I know we've got a big queue of individuals who've asked questions in the chat box.
Can I just wrap it up with one last?
Yeah, one quick wrap up, Wendy. Go for it.
So in the presentation and in the report that I referenced for the Edison Ramp Review from May of 2019, we referenced the IEEE Standard Dictionary of Electrical and Electronic Terms in 1992, because that's what I have actually, a 1992 dictionary. And in there we referenced the definition of a circuit from NESD, the definition of a line section, and the definition of a line segment. And I think I would encourage you to be looking at that for the SURE threshold, because the definition of line segment is a portion of a line section that has a particular type of construction or is exposed to a particular type of failure, and therefore may be regarded as a single entity for the purpose of reporting and analyzing failure and exposure data. My point is that the utilities do have a lot of fault data. They have fault recorders, they have SCADA, they have other intelligent devices. There is a lot of data out there. Perhaps we need to be pulling in the protection engineers more into this risk profiling and into the development of some kind of SURE threshold. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wendy. I think that there's definitely a place for programmatic reporting and controls for the regulators in their work with the IOUs. But I think that by its nature, a program report is supposed to be the aggregate of the projects, and that's what this is driving towards, is like a transparent, known way of analyzing where best to put mitigation projects and how to measure their effectiveness. That's what the Assured Network is, or idea is about. And I have taken a lot of artistic license in when designing the presentation because I tried to make sure that it's clear that we're not recommending a particular methodology. How that gets done is going to be with a lot of involvement of every parties and IOUs and the CPUC. So it's just this concept that we want to be able to get across. And in the interest of time, I'm going to go on to PG&E's John Fallman. John?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, this is John Eric Tallman. I run a group in asset management and PG&E called Risk and Data Analytics. And just want to say that really appreciate the presentation that John made, and I really feel encouraged by a lot of the comments that have been made after John's presentation, because I feel like what John presented is a great example of how risk spend efficiency and risk reduction scores at a more granular level can provide transparency and clarity around investment decisions. And more than just proving that it's the right work to do, I think it provides a better way to measure the risk and the safety of the electric grid. I especially like the idea that we're talking about a threshold. I think that's key. I recognize that as the maturity of models improve, our ability to identify thresholds will improve. And so I think it's unrealistic to say, hey, we got to identify a threshold right now. While that would be helpful, I think we need to recognize that you got to have a mature model so that regulators and utilities and other parties can have a more informed discussion about what is the right threshold and how is it measured. So I like where John's pointing us that as we get this ability, then we need to start thinking now about how are we going to determine a threshold when we at that point, and what features and capabilities in our models do we need to be able to identify those thresholds. I think there's some good examples in other regulatory arenas. Personally, as I've been working on modeling and capabilities at PG&E, I've been looking to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and how they work with nuclear power plants. And maybe I've been involved in all the discussions in RAMP and SMAP and all those things, so maybe people have already talked about this, but from my observation, it seems that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the nuclear power plants have a very strong and tight regulatory relationship. And I think it's enabled by the existence of these types of risk models where the Regulatory Commission can prescribe, hey, you will operate within these bounds, and anytime you're within this range, you need to file a report and let us know how that's going, you know, what happened and what you're mitigating to do, so that they're always talking about minimizing, if you will, the near hits, and not talking about how close they are to the edge for a catastrophic event. And then the nuclear power plant, because they use the same tools that the Regulatory Commission is talking about, they can report back and say, hey, this is how we're operating the plant. This is the probability of a catastrophic event. These are, if they're asking for more funds or they're talking about improvements to the plant, they quantify those in terms of that risk model. So I think that's a good example for us to aspire to. I guess I just want to, I'm really encouraged by the comments that I see that are supportive for what Sean's talking about. I want to indicate, and I hope it's already indicated that in some of our RAMP filings and wildfire mitigation plans, that PG&E is pointed in this direction. This is the world we're trying to create, and how we represent our work. We realize it's a journey, and we want to highlight that the identification of thresholds is something I think will be enabled by improved models, and that it's a dialogue that takes time. In the case of the Regulatory Commission, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, I think it took upwards of a decade to get to that point. Confident that we can learn from them and do that quicker, but I think those are good examples. So I should probably pause there if there's any questions, but those are the points I really wanted to highlight and express PG&E's support for this kind of approach.
Appreciate that, John Eric. You know, I want to note that while I did make this recommendation, I didn't invent the concept of there being a threshold of risk. You know, the Wildfire Safety Division, when it formulated the 2020 Wildfire Mitigation Plan guidelines, included a section called Grid Hardening Operating Criteria. It didn't define that operating criteria, but it definitely created a venue within the WMPs for the IOUs or for the WSD to further develop that. So that concept is, you know, that's a reliability engineering concept about maximum risk. And, you know, the tools you needed in order to do that is to be able to quantify risk in the different configurations of whatever asset, be it a nuclear power plant, be it a car manufacturing factory, or be it a utility. That's a common concept. So I appreciate your comments and support. But yeah, I just wanted to note that's already been an existing concept. The recommendations that I have been able to help the WSAB make has been to concentrate on that, to accelerate that. And even though, yes, I think in my conversations with Arthur that, I agree with the comments that he made that this is something that will probably take years. But if we know it's coming, if we know that this criteria is coming, that this resiliency threshold is coming, maybe we can start having the IOUs attempt to do their resource allocations in such a way that when this threshold does come, all the different mitigations that they've been doing between now and then, we can retroactively apply this grid hardening or the SURE threshold, and maybe we can gain benefit in the future from PSPS relief from investments that we're making today. That's the if you know it's coming and you know you're going to be able to get two birds with one stone in the future, just make sure you put the stones in the right spot so that you can in the future get that PSPS reduction.
John, thank you very much. This is Arthur. I know that we have several questions in the queue right now. It's 20 minutes to 1. I'm willing to devote 10, 15 minutes to those questions to make sure that we cover the most important ones, but we'll need to at least have 5 minutes at the end in order to tell people what to expect next. So Ryan and Coco, what do we got in the queue?
Thanks, Arthur. This is Coco. I'll go ahead and start. Maybe we want to start here. This question, Mr. Maters, directly for you. The question was, did you share this presentation or the concepts discussed in it with PG&E and get any feedback, input back in preparation of your presentation today?
I did. I made a presentation to each one of my respondents, and we shared the draft. I would say that PG&E responded in that they are working along a similar line of developing risk calculations. It was somewhat validating in that this is an engineering problem, and so when you apply engineering principles, there's going to be commonalities amongst solutioning, and so it was able to see that, and that was helpful in being able to see that we're on the right track. I do want to reiterate that when I work for the Wildfire Safety Advisory Board, I work for the people of California, and I'm able to make the distinction, and I prioritize the interests of the people of California. But in this, I think that there are positives for both the regulators and for the utilities. If the utilities can confidently be able to show that their mitigation expenditures are cost effective and in the interest of the people, and if the regulators are able to audit and be able to see and confirm that, I think that that's the good of everyone involved.
And the next question was, can you expand on why the thresholds in the SURE example table are based on sustained wind over that operational working hour? Why aren't historical or forecasted wind gusts the principal measurement?
So once again, I didn't want to favor one methodology. I mean, I had to pick a methodology in order to have an illustrative example. Originally, in the original version of this, I started to go into that level of detail. But when we're talking about something multiplied by something, 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 if you make too many variables in any one of those particular attribute boxes, including wind, then you're going to get a very, very, very complicated example. This example is already very complicated. and its only purpose is to get the consequence, to get the idea of quantified risk reduction, and a risk threshold, and then economic analysis to drive good resource allocation. That's really what the recommendation is about. And if I went into all of those details, it would detract from being able to show how, if you could do those, you can get this, which is that better benefit for the same amount of expenditure of resources.
Thanks. And some additional questions. One was, how would this model, the SURE model, quantify PSPS harm so that it could be compared directly with wildfire consequence?
Yeah, I couldn't get there because that's an apple and an orange. So I kept referencing apples and oranges. So apples is the wildfire risk reduction that you get. In using this idea, you can get an actual projected out number, and then you can get a projected out number of, initially I was using customer outage minutes due to PSPS. But I simplified that a little bit further. But when you do your risk-spend efficiency calculations, you're going to have two different risk-spend efficiency calculations. So, I mean, you use a bracket and a comma. Technically, I think mathematically that's how you do it. But they're definitely two different things that you can't add together. How you judge which one is more important, that's where the subjective stance would come in. But that's also why when I was making comments responding to the responders, I noted that, you may do a calculations where you don't get any PSPS reduction, but you avoid such a high consequence potential wildfire that it's worth doing that. And that's going to be some of the subjective decisions that are made. But as long as you report it in a consistent way, then, everybody who's auditing or looking at that, or the project authorizations, it'll be clear, what the benefits are.
Thanks for that. And one other question I wanted to send out there was, have you or the board given any thought to who is supposed to organize this effort and how it would be funded?
So that's not within the scope of this recommendation. I mean, I have a number of thoughts, but talking to the CPUC Policy Division and the other parties and respondents, there's already existing proceedings. There may be that this could be looked to be put into. This is something that's probably going to take a number of years because it's a fairly large project. But the WSD is looking at trying to move this forward. So working with the WSD, the CPUC, and then of course through that process, if there's a proceeding, all the different parties that would participate. I imagine that's how this would be developed and be implemented.
Thanks. And I believe, Arthur and Ryan, that covers the questions I saw.
Okay,
outstanding.
So we'll give the audience one more opportunity. If there's any major question that comes on, we're doing really well on time. And I'm going to ask Robert to unshare the screen so that I can bring up the last important screen. There we go. Can you all see the blue screen, the blue slide with dates on it? Somebody. All right, I guess I have to go back and try and share. I'm unable to share. I don't know what's going on here.
Yeah, Arthur, it's Ryan. I can't see it at the moment. I'm
yeah,
get it up momentarily.
I think because IT is sharing the screen, and currently I see a slide of additional considerations from that. If we can close that out and unshare the screen, then I can pull up what I have. We're all learning as we go.
Sorry, Art, we're running into a little technical difficulty here.
Okay, now it looks like I can share my screen now. There you go. Are we able to see the blue with the dates?
Very good.
Anyone? Very good. Okay.
Yep.
I'll just make this comment, and somebody else had made it, and I think that it's a good one, is that with the introduction of this new rulemaking on risk-based decision-making that specifically has kind of asked for comments on additional metrics, that maybe that's the really good forum for this to be developed, because you have all the same parties and players that have proven to be able to work together really well on developing the settlement methodology for SMAP and RAMP. And within that context, it's very structured so that you can set up technical working groups and bring it into workshop mode and then make a proposal to the commission, sometimes even settle so everybody agrees on it. The issue there is resources. And in the past SMAP, as Katie knows, we really depended on TURN's ability to bring in outside experts and the joint interveners to bring in outside experts to help develop these things. So, but that's at least a good home for it that WSD can't really provide at this point because we're working outside the range of proceedings. So just put that in note, and I'm sorry I don't have the dates in front of me, but pretty soon people are being asked to comment on the OIR in that proceeding, and so that would be a good place to raise that issue so it gets scoped into the case. Okay, I want to thank everybody.
Arthur, this is Katie. I just wanted to say I think those comments are due Monday.
Oh, okay, so pencil it
That's
in.
correct. Opening comments.
Right. I want to thank everybody both for the thoughtful presentations and responses and for staying on time. I mean, that is like the most important job for workshop moderators, make sure the train comes in to the station at the right time. So we're going to be meeting again tomorrow. Tomorrow's start is 10 a.m. and there are two big issues on the agenda. The first is Coco talking about the data schema that we've referred to a number of times. And then after a break, we'll be talking about safety culture. In particular, WSD is charged with coming up with a process for doing an annual safety culture assessment of the electric utilities that goes into the consideration of safety certification that is all built into how the utilities can access funds from the insurance pool and what the basis for determining whether they can have access to that. So we'll talk about that more tomorrow. For today, again, we're looking at August 26th as a date to share your comments. They should go to the Wildfire Safety Division email address that we have up on the screen and also be served on the service list, 1810-007. You all know how to do that. 20-page limit, please. If you absolutely have to go past that, send us an email, and we'll consider it. But we really, we know that there's a lot to take in here with 4 different big topics. Yes, the SURE standard is subject to comments, but I think that you may find that specific comments might do better when we find a home for the development of it. So I'll just put that out there. Again, October 31st is the date when we're supposed to submit the guidelines. Expect to see it a lot sooner than that, as much as 6 weeks in advance. You'll probably see a draft of the resolution or the mailing of the resolution sometime in mid-October in order to get on the Commission's agenda for November 19th. With that, I think we're done. I'll bring it back to Ryan.
Just real.
Is there anything else we need to do?
Yeah, just real quickly. Of course, Arthur, we owe you a big thank you, and know a lot of the work that you've done over the last months have led to this workshop in terms of developing the staff proposal and herding everyone together so we could have a productive workshop presentation. So thank you, Arthur.
Okay.
One note.
Virtual applause for Robert Stanford, who was our IT guru, who helped keep this going. It's always touch and go, I have to say, working with the Commission for, more than 15 years here. You never know how it's going to come out, but it came out well today. So thank you, Robert.
You're welcome.
One final note to clarify as well. A comment had come in earlier about whether what we were discussing today was about the WMP Wildfire Mitigation Plan submittal or the process for updating the 2021 guidelines. And just to be crystal clear, this is about the update to the 2021 WMP guidelines that was discussed today, among other things and other topics, which we will get into tomorrow. So just wanted to make sure that that came home for the group. But yes, as Arthur said, we're looking forward to receiving your written comments by August 26th, and we kick off tomorrow at 10 a.m. All of the Webex information, if you didn't receive it through the email that went out to the service list last week, is available on our website at www.cpuc.ca.gov/ this is all one word, Wildfire Mitigation Plans. And with that, let me just pause for 1 second here. Okay.
Yeah, and I'll just say that John's initial write-up of the SHORE proposal is part of the attachment of the WSAB report that was issued at the end of June. That is also available on the PUC website. You might have to hunt for it, but you can get it if you go to the WSD, the Wildfire Safety Division main page. I know that there's a link to it.
Okay. Great. And with that, we will end today's workshop and see many of you tomorrow at 10 a.m. Thank you.